There is unity in the oppression. There must be absolute unity and determination in the response. There is unity in the oppression. There must be absolute unity and determination in the response.
Welcome to the 27th Vigil for Julian Assange, 2 weeks after he was arrested and remains in Belmarsh Prison in London. I'm joined by my co-host, Elizabeth Voss.
Hi, everyone. I'm Elizabeth Voss. I'm a freelance journalist and co-host of Unity 4J.
And we're going to begin with some headlines. The top story is an article in a publication called netspolitik.org, a German online digital news website that has gotten into trouble with German authorities in the past for leaks that they have published. They have an article that came out not too long ago, like within the last 24 hours. It says, I quote, as soon as the London police carried Julian Assange from Ecuador's embassy, the US demanded his extradition. The allegation in the indictment of March 2018 is conspiracy to penetrate computers, maximum penalties 5 years imprisonment, but it should not stay that way. Only one day after writing the indictment, that would be in March 2018 as well, the U.S. Attorney General admitted to investigate also, this is a translation from German, so it's a bit awkward, admitted to investigate for unauthorized receipt and dissemination of secret information. The Department of Justice wrote that in a letter to lawyers of the former WikiLeaks associate Daniel Ellsberg. The letter is published in full. It's a very legalistic letter. At one point, it seems like it's offering immunity to Domscheit-Berg, and at other times it sounds like they would prosecute him as well, and there's no immunity. The allegation is the prosecution on the Espionage Act, and that is indeed the unauthorized receipt and dissemination of secret information. A while back, Sandra Fairbanks wrote that the authorities in the U.S. were going after associates of Julian Assange and what appears to be concentric circles moving out from Assange to those who were close to him. Now, Domscheit-Berg, of course, was very close to Julian in the time of the publication of the Manning leaks. Therefore, they seem to be concentrating the authorities again on that period, which is why Chelsea Manning remains in a jail in Alexandria, Virginia, because she's refusing to testify about what appears to be a superseding indictment that will go way beyond the 5-year charge for supposedly penetrating a government computer, which he didn't really do. He only tried to help Manning hide her identity because she had legal access to that information. They want him for more than 5 years, clearly. And what all the indications are is they're going to go after him and cross that red line into the Espionage Act, particularly Section E, which says anyone with unauthorized possession and or dissemination of classified information is liable to be prosecuted under the Act. This is what this long letter to Domscheit-Berg appears to indicate, that they are going to go after Julian for that section of the Espionage Act, which would cross a huge red line in terms of criminalizing journalism. It's something the Obama administration did not do, but the Trump administration appears hell-bent to do. And as long as Manning is still in prison, we know that she is needed for the testimony to bring that superseding indictment about. And apparently they need also Daniel Domscheit-Berg to also testify. Now, they had a infamous crack up, Domscheit-Berg and Julian, and they no longer work with each other. It was over the issue of the Cablegate releases and whether to redact names in there. That's too complicated to go into it at this moment. But the fact that he did break with Assange may indicate to the authorities that they'd like to get people who are disgruntled or bitter. But if, in fact, this letter from the government attorney general of the U.S. to Domscheit-Berg is real and authentic, that's published on netspolitik.org, then it would appear that he leaked it, because it doesn't seem to be anyone else who would have it except he or him or his lawyers. And the letter does say, I've read it, that he must not obviously keep this secret. He cannot release it. So if it was Domscheit-Berg and he did leak this to this publication, Netspolitik, and he does live in Germany, and this is a German publication that does leaks like this, then it would appear to indicate he's not interested in testifying against Julian Assange, which would be a great advance there, because the U.S. thinks they need him, and he, even though he's was disgruntled, he might have seen, like many people are saying, that once he was carried out of that embassy, that the game changed. Even if you had personal feuds with Assange in the past, even if you didn't like him personally, people standing up, people like the Committee to Protect Journalists, Ken Roth of Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, these groups are supporting him, even if they didn't agree with anything that he did during the election in 2016, or they don't like him personally. This is not totally irrelevant. And I think this could be another indication of Assange, by releasing this, does not want to testify if, in fact, this is accurate. I've asked Cassandra to join us to talk about this because she was the first, to my knowledge, that pointed out that they were going after people around him, which is extremely alarming, obviously, to see that they want to, in my view, want to not just get Julian Assange, but try to break down WikiLeaks because they know it still works and still publishing. And that's, I think, their ultimate aim. And so this is a very alarming development. Elizabeth.
Absolutely. No, it's extremely alarming. And I hope that Cassandra will be able to join us later in the stream in order to discuss this. And if not this week, then next week for sure. And moving on to some other headlines, obviously, it's been a very busy few weeks since April 11th and Assange's arrest. We also saw an Icelandic court ordering the previously Visa Iceland, now called Valitor or Valitor Payments, to pay $10 million, which is 1.2 billion in Icelandic currency, in damages for blocking the credit card donations to WikiLeaks in 2011. Valitor stated that it is likely to appeal and that it is a subsidiary. We also want to mention that it's a subsidiary of Arian Banki. So in addition to that, we also saw yesterday there was a visit to Julian Assange in Belmarsh prison by Professor Joe Kanatachi, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to privacy. Again, he saw him in Belmarsh prison. And he said he conducted, quote, an official visit with Julian Assange at Belmarsh prison as part of the UN official visit. The delegation also met with Jennifer Robinson at Doughty Street Chambers, obviously counsel to Assange. And this is from a statement or a publication from Doughty Street and Assange's legal representatives. So Assange raised concerns with violations of his right to privacy inside the embassy of Ecuador, given the level of surveillance he was under, including his legal meetings with Ms. Robinson and other members of his international legal team. And continuing with this article from Doughty Street Chambers, it says that the UN announced on April 5 that the UN Special Rapporteur had the agreement of Ecuador to visit Assange in the embassy on the 25th of April to, quote, help determine if there exists a prima facie case of violation of privacy that warrants further investigation. The announcement made clear that the United Nations Special Rapporteur had received assurances from the government of Ecuador that it will facilitate his visit to the country's embassy in London. But as we know, on the 10th of April, WikiLeaks announced that it had proof of the extent of the surveillance and interference with the right to privacy inside the embassy, which included the recording of visits by his lawyers, including the copying of their notes, as well as recording visits from his doctors. And on the next day, April 11th, Mr. Assange was forcefully removed from the embassy by British police after the ambassador notified him of that his asylum had been revoked, and they then invited the British police inside the embassy. The article from Doughty Street Chambers finishes with a quote from Jennifer Robinson, which says, quote, "We welcome the continued engagement of the United Nations special mechanisms in Mr. Assange's case. It is a matter of grave concern that Ecuador expelled Mr. Assange from the embassy before the scheduled UN visit could take place, and we are grateful to the United Nations Special Rapporteur, Professor Kanatachi, for arranging for the visit to take place at Belmarsh prison." And so I don't know if you have any thoughts to share on that, Joe, but I just want to say that I'm really impressed that the UN that the Special Rapporteur made efforts to see Assange at Belmarsh prison, that he continued with his plans to investigate Ecuador's alleged invasion of Assange's privacy, which we've seen evidence of, in the days and weeks since Assange was arrested. We've witnessed Ecuador basically leaking footage and photographs of Assange within the embassy to the press in order for tabloid press and some establishment media to basically mock Assange for having been a victim of the Western powers, siege on the embassy for so many years.
Yes, indeed. Stefan Morizzi, a fantastic journalist for La Repubblica, got to question Joe Kanatachi. Before I go into that, I just wanted to add to the first item that WikiLeaks tweeted out that Netspolitik article about the letter to Assange. They headlined it that the authorities are going after Julian on the Espionage Act. So clearly, WikiLeaks sees it as being authentic. So I think we have to take it very seriously. Now, following up on what Elizabeth just said about Kanatachi's visit, yes, I agree that it was he was not deterred by the imprisonment, and it's good that the authorities let him in, which is what they have to do anyway. So they didn't try to pull a fast one on that. Now, Stefania, I'm going to read the Q&A that she had with Kanatachi because I think it gives some insights into what that visit would have been like. So Stefania asks, will you be acting in the upcoming weeks on the images, videos, the videos of Assange's meetings and activities in the embassy, which have been circulating? Kanatachi said, I will certainly act. We should be sending an official request to the government of Spain to facilitate my access to the inquiring judge in Spain. This, I should give a little background. This is it comes from that press conference on April 10, the day before Assange was arrested, led by WikiLeaks in London, in which they unveiled that a group of criminals allegedly try to shake down WikiLeaks for 3 million euros. It was an extortion scheme in which they told WikiLeaks that we will release all of this footage and documents about Assange in the embassy if you don't hand over the money. And cleverly, the WikiLeaks went along with it until they were able to wire one of the lawyers, and he went in there and got more evidence, and they approached the police, and the police have begun this investigation into this extortion by these Spanish criminals. The big question is, how did they get their hands on these videos, some of which show Julian with his lawyers, clear breach of attorney-client privilege, and even more shockingly, maybe with his doctors being examined. Those videos were part of the cash that these criminals got their hands on. The only people who would have that, of course, would be first the Ecuadorian government, but very likely other governments that they were conspiring with to arrest Assange illegally against the UN refugee treaty of 1951. That would be, of course, the United States and Britain. So we could assume, without knowing for sure, that they also had access to those surveillance videos. It had to come probably from one of those three governments, very likely from Ecuador. We don't know that. How did the criminals get their hands on all this stuff? So somehow that happened. And that could be proven by this judge. That would be extraordinary, because any of those governments, or whoever it was, whether it was a rogue member of one of these governments that did it, would also be wanting to get paid for that. So that would be part of this criminal conspiracy. If the Spanish judge can get down to the bottom and maybe blow open a huge scandal where someone in one of the governments actually passed this surveillance stuff over to these three thugs, one of which had already spent years in jail on a similar crime of extortion. So back to Kanatachi, he says, as we understand it, the images have been the subject of an investigation by the Spanish police, according to the Spanish Penal Code, headed by an inquiring magistrate. If and when my access is granted, that evidence might consist of thousands of surveillance footage, which will take some time to watch. I started the action within hours of my knowledge. I knew the press conference called by WikiLeaks on the 10th of April, and by the evening of that day, I had already formulated a number of questions to Mr. Assange's legal team, which were sent. Stefania, it has been really disturbing because whenever we journalists met Julian Assange in the embassy, our meetings were exposed to such pervasive surveillance. Kanatachi says, as you can see, this is not just a matter of privacy, but it's also a matter of confidentiality. There's a distinction between privacy and confidentiality. There's a matter of attorney-client confidentiality, a matter of journalistic freedom and protection of sources. There is a number of human rights that come together. There are many dimensions to the case, including freedom of expression, including whistleblowing, protection of journalistic sources. Stefani then asks, will you ask Ecuador questions about their role in the creation and dissemination of these files? And Kanatachi answers, I can comment on that only once I have the results on that from the Spanish investigation. We have to see who did this, whether it was an official action or rogue action. The word I used as well, rogue. That's what I think. Elizabeth.
Yeah, it's an incredible story. I'm so glad that Stefania was able to interview Joe Kanatachi from the UN. It's really great that she was able to provide his thoughts after visiting Assange. We also have a statement by Fidel Narvaez, who is a former diplomat and at the London Embassy of Ecuador. He had these statements to share on the expulsion of Julian Assange, saying, quote, Moreno is unforgivable. He has shamed my country. That will go down as a historic shame. and that was from, I believe, bt.com. I don't know whether that's an Ecuadorian outlet or not, but in any case, we also have a speech by Tony Kevin in Canberra. He said, and I will be reading part of this, and then Joe will be reading another part of it, because we have the entire speech here, and it's an important one, and we want to share it. So he said, quote, "We live in dangerous times. U.S. imperial power is flailing around in its death throes, making trouble for people and nations all over the world, blocking real action on climate change, trying to foment regime change in Venezuela and Iran, troublemaking in the South China Sea, illegally maintaining military presences in Syria. The US government elite remains obsessively Russophobic. The nuclear arms race is slipping out of control under dangerous American illusions of global military supremacy. We are living through the most perilous moment since the Cuban Missile Crisis, more perilous even since the craziness of Russiagate. Pardon me, the US government is not currently even speaking to Russia. And here in Australia, we have a crucially important election underway, whose outcome will be vital to our young people and other disadvantaged communities. So why bother about this person called Julian Assange, this one weird middle-aged guy who seems to have a knack for getting up the noses of so many powerful people and governments? Aren't there bigger things we need to think about other than the fate of this one particular troublesome person? Should we not just think of him as collateral damage of the past 20 years and move on to more important and current debates and causes? The fact that some of us are here today for this demonstration in a city not big on demonstrations shows we do not accept that argument. We recognize that Julian is pivotal to so much that is happening around us. In these dangerous times, we need to gather around him to protect him from his bitter enemies, not just because it is the decent thing to do, and it is, but because our country needs him, his idealism and energy and political insights. People like Julian are rare, and we need to give him our love and respect and loyalty and protection.
That city he mentions is Canberra, the capital of Australia, where there was a rally on Thursday in Australia, where Tony Kevin made these remarks, pretty extraordinary, tough remarks from a former Australian ambassador to Russia as well. And he's talking about, and will continue with his speech, as quote, "There is nothing here today that you won't know already. Fears and arguments flow freely around the internet. It is easy to like Facebook and Twitter, to read and comment and encourage one another's work. We all know Julian's importance. That is why we are here. We could all be at home reading and writing on our iPads, but here we are in the public square in front of the UK embassy, HC, the embassy of America's most important lackey state, in the capital of city of America's second most important lackey state, Australia. We are gathered together just down the hill from our Parliament House, where Australian national security policy is debated and determined. The fact that we have come together in this place today, an act of real physical politics, sends an important message to our power elites. We want to make them uncomfortable. We want to be the burrs in their saddles. If we do that, we're achieving something here today. Julian is now in great danger. He faces extradition from Britain to the heartland of the American empire. They want to silence him, to bury him in U.S. prison for the rest of his life, as they wanted to bury Chelsea Manning for 35 years, a sentence only commuted by Obama, an act of decency as he left office, to 9 years. As now, Manning is indefinitely back in jail again. She's a truly heroic person. The current U.S. effort to extradite Julian, now exposed after years of denial, is an act of pure vengeance and spite, and intended to intimidate others who might be tempted to follow Julian's and Chelsea's noble examples. It is what apartheid South Africa did to Nelson Mandela. They failed to suppress his thought and nobility, and these people will fail too. Around the world, people are rising up in protest at the cruel political persecution now being inflicted on Julian and Chelsea. The US and UK secret states are throwing everything they can at Julian now. The full resources of Anglo-American information warfare, of the most malevolent psyops, psychological operations and warfare, have been deployed against this one man. Caitlin Johnstone, whose website I urge you to follow if you do not do so already, recently brilliantly listed and analyzed 27 big lies that are being spread about Julian and their efforts to discredit him and to limit the reach of his voice. Caitlin convincingly rebutted each of those lies. After today's event, please go and read her piece. It all boils down to a simple either-or proposition. Either Julian is crazy and dangerous and must be locked up for life, or those out to get him are committing evil acts. Maybe they're crazy and dangerous and need to be locked up for life. That's my insertion there. There can be no sitting on the fence on this one, no careful balancing of pros and cons on each side. We're talking about an innocent man's life and about the attempt by malign state forces to silence this great man's voice. Assange started with the idea that raw state power can and must be fought and exposed with truth and public opinion, that we must demand our governments behave decently, especially when they go to war. This is the same ideal that inspired Dan Ellsberg to leak the Pentagon Papers during the Vietnam War, Woodward and Bernstein to expose Nixon's Watergate crimes, Ed Snowden to expose the illegal U.S. government intelligence gathering on its own citizens, and Julian Assange to expose especially American war crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan. Nothing better shows the crucial importance of what Assange and Manning did than the release by WikiLeaks of the 18-minute film Collateral Murder, the full video and audio record of a mass murder of civilians carried out by a U.S. military helicopter over Baghdad. Not only did they murder a large group of unarmed, innocent civilians in the street, a few minutes later, they blew up an ambulance team and a bus that came to collect the bodies, and a few people still alive, a bus that even contained children. Correction, it wasn't an ambulance, it was some civilians acting like an ambulance. And they enjoyed themselves, they congratulated themselves on their marksmanship. They gloried in these cruel murders. None of these war criminals were ever brought to justice, nor ever will be. The video was suppressed until Manning somehow got it out to WikiLeaks. This was whistleblowing in the public interest of the highest order. If WikiLeaks had done nothing else, this film proved its vital importance. WikiLeaks has opened the gates to a whole new way of challenging the imperial state and its false propaganda. This is a healthy public skepticism out there. There is a healthy public skepticism out there. Lies are being and will be challenged and exposed. Excuse me. Julian and his team showed the way to the heroism of our own witness Kay and Bernard Colliery in this city over the Australian government's illegal spying during an important negotiation with the East Timor government, a case with which you will all be familiar, at least all those at that demonstration in Canberra, maybe not our international audience. Mainstream media are more and more being forced to account for themselves, to look critically at their own role in normalizing and explaining away state misconduct. People like us, however, angry we might make people like Chris Ullman and Michael Rowland, and I like and respect them both as good mainstream journalists, Australian journalists, have an essential role to play in holding a blowtorch to the feet of power and to those who surround and protect and normalize power.
And I just want to insert, before I continue with Tony Kevin's amazing speech, I just want to add on the collateral murder piece that it is amazing the impact that that had, not just because of the fact that images themselves are visceral, they elicit a visceral response, but because unlike other WikiLeaks publications, you don't have to sit and pour through hundreds of thousands of documents to access the entirety of that publication. So I think that also made it uniquely important. So, but continuing with Tony Kevin's speech, he says, quote, "Finally, what message can we send today to help Julian? We wish he were here in this little piece of British territory across the road called the UK High Commission. We wish we could go in there and bring him out to freedom, as British police brutally dragged him out of another embassy to a different kind of jail, a British prison in London. But we can send a powerful message. We need to demand of the British government, and I hope people are listening to us in there, these things." And he says in parentheses, "I have sent them a copy of these words." Then he continues saying, "First, fair and decent conditions of imprisonment in Belmarsh prison as Julian awaits legal proceedings and during these proceedings. Proper accommodation, access to fresh air and sunlight and exercise, proper medical care, adequate visiting rights by his family, friends and legal team, and regular and reported consular visits from the Australian High Commission consular staff. All of these things are basic human rights due to any Australian citizen imprisoned in a foreign country. Our government needs to demand these things, as it did for James Ricketson in Cambodia, for Peter Greste in Egypt, for our footballer in Thailand, but did not do for David Hicks and Mamdouh Habib in the US, and until recent days was not doing for Julian. We need to challenge the complacent assumption of our government, Labour opposition, and the mainstream media that bad stuff cannot be done to Australian citizens by the governments of our great and powerful friends, Britain and the United States. It can be, and it is. Secondly, and crucially, we need to demand our political elites, in this case, Foreign Minister Marise Payne and her shadow, Penny Wong, and behind them, the major party leaders, Scott Morrison and Bill Shorten, that they strenuously and forcefully demand of the British government that it not allow Julian to be extradited to the United States. We know what will happen to him there. We see what is done to political prisoners of conscience, Chelsea Manning and Maria Butina. We cannot allow this to happen to Julian, to become a lifetime political prisoner of conscience in a United States jail. We need to demand of Marise Payne and Penny Wong that they publicly and jointly or separately commit to making the strongest representations to the British government to bring Julian safely home to Australia after his bail issue is legally concluded in the United Kingdom. His extradition to the US must be firmly denied because it is entirely vindictive and political exemplary punishment. We cannot trust American justice in this matter. We must protect Julian now so that he can return to safety and resume public interest work in his home country, Australia. We are proud of our fellow Australian, and we must now stand by him in his hour of greatest need. Thank you. And that is the end of Tony Kevin's speech in Canberra, as we mentioned earlier, on the 26th of April this year. So it was today, date-wise, but for us in the United States, it was yesterday. So, Joe, you're muted.
As well, maybe people are sick of my voice, so that might be a good thing. That was a very extraordinary speech, and it's very hard to follow up and say anything more than that. There's not much more that Tony didn't say there, and say it very, very well. And this, again, is from a senior ambassador, former ambassador of Australia, and it occurred to me that the only thing that moves politicians to do anything is the fear that they may lose their job. And that means being voted out. So this somehow has to become an issue, an electoral issue in Australia, the fate of Assange. For members of parliament, for those who are in the cabinet, this is got to be a number one issue. And I don't know how many people showed up at that rally. I'm hoping it was large, because that's the only way we're going to get any kind of politician anywhere in the world where there's some semblance of democracy called an election to do a damn thing about this. Because they're not going to act on principle. You know, Tony Kevin is acting on principle here. He has nothing to gain from doing this. And probably a lot of grief from his former colleagues and people in the government he might know. Still from his days when he was in the government. So it's got to be somehow made clear to these folks that, in the US too, by the way, that particularly the chief guy is sitting in the White House, that he has to do something to help Assange, or he could be hurt. We heard last week, if you remember, Elizabeth, from Lee Stranahan, who has abandoned his support for Trump. He abandoned his support for Trump because of what happened, the arrest. And he claimed that there were like 20%, I don't know, that wasn't scientific, but in his view, about 20% of Trump's supporters have abandoned him because of the arrest of Assange. So this has to be made to be a firm electoral issue on both sides of the Pacific, both sides of the Atlantic. And we're doing our part here to get it out, to make people understand what's at stake, Elizabeth.
Absolutely. I think these vigils must continue. I think that it's really important as well, as Tony Kevin did. He mentioned, collateral murder. He mentioned the importance of WikiLeaks as in terms of its publications. I think that was a brilliant part of that speech. But I also think as well, it was also really great to see him cite Caitlin Johnstone, who's an independent journalist who has been, really hitting hard on against the smears of Assange that have happened, obviously, since he was arrested and beforehand. So really fantastic speech. I'm glad that we were able to read it in full.
Yes. And to give a shameless plug to Grim News, we have begun a series, and Elizabeth wrote the first one on collateral murder video. The series is to highlight, in hopefully a dozen, 20, we don't know how many articles we're going to do yet. There's just so much material in there over the years from WikiLeaks. We're going to look into all of their releases and look into the background of those releases, and most importantly, the impact that those releases had, the reactions that they engendered. And this is what the point Tony's making here when he's talking about the collateral murder. That one alone shows the worth that WikiLeaks has had to populations around the world, in the Middle East in particular, and in the United States. That alone, however, is what really turned the United States government against Assange. Shortly thereafter, the Afghan war diaries, and then the Afghan war logs, and the State Department cables is when they started the first grand jury hearing to try to indict Assange. Ultimately, that failed in terms of the Obama administration not actually indicting Assange, because they realized that they would cross that line and get him on that section of the Espionage Act, which is on the books. They can prosecute him. No president has ever prosecuted a publisher on that section. They tried to go after the two New York Times. I'm saying they, I mean the Nixon administration tried to go after two New York Times reporters who had worked on the Pentagon Papers case. They impaneled a grand jury in Boston, and it collapsed when the Ellsberg case collapsed. The Ellsberg case, of course, Dan Ellsberg leaked the Pentagon Papers to the New York Times and the Washington Post. They were top secret documents. Both the Post and the Times and about 20 other newspapers published classified information that Ellsberg put out there in his effort to end the Vietnam War. So those newspapers courageously broke the law as it's written. They were not allowed to receive or possess classified information. They were never authorized to do that. Ellsberg was authorized to do that. They were not allowed to disseminate that information, as the Espionage Act says, but they disseminated the information. That's called courage. That's called what journalism is supposed to do. It's supposed to hold powerful to account. And there's two other points that could be made legally here about that very act of the leaking and the publishing that run up against Section E of the Espionage Act. And number one, the Nuremberg Code of Justice says that it's the duty of a military person, and by the way, Ellsberg was in the military as well, and of course Chelsea Manning was, to disobey orders and to expose and complain about crimes that are being committed that they see. That is part of the oath that soldier makes. They have to not commit a crime, number one, and report that crime. And number two, there was that order, I don't remember the number, of Obama, that said that an executive order that said the executive order that said that the no information that is embarrassing or reveals criminality can be classified. Now, there are, Trump has made, it was Executive Order 13526, if anybody wants to look it up. Now, Trump has made executive orders like, pieces of candy. He's been issuing them since he came in immediately to office. And he has got, this is what Obama did. In other words, he put out that order and is not being paid attention to. So some executive orders are listened to and followed through on, but this one, I don't know why Obama did it. I don't know how serious he was, but no one seems to know about it and care about it. But it's clear that the leaks, many of the leaks that came from the U.S. government to WikiLeaks should never have been classified under that executive order. I don't know if it's retroactive, but certainly Chelsea did her duty by revealing a crime that should never have been classified. And that is what WikiLeaks has done. And the public has to know this so they could put pressure on these politicians who don't give a damn in general about the public after an election. So they've got to know that their jobs are on the line. Elizabeth.
Absolutely. No, I completely agree. I think that it's really, really important that we all do the best we can at this time to stand up for Assange, to use our voices. And I see, as I was checking chat, I saw a lot of people saying that they feel powerless, what can they do and all of that. And we've had that discussion endlessly on the Vigils. But I will reiterate again that, what I've said basically throughout this entire process from the time that Assange was silenced and isolated within the embassy to the, and through his arrest and expulsion. And that is that everyone, I can't give advice we can't give advice that will be correct and effective for any single person, or that would apply across the board. So whatever it is that you have available to you, whether it's, being located in a city where you can go and stand with a street sign, or whether it's, having money that you can donate, whether it's being very well connected with friends that you can have over for some sort of, watch party, potluck event, whatever it is. If you're an artist, a musician, look at your own surroundings, your own talents, and your own tools that you have available in order to fight this fight, and empower yourself, knowing that you are the only person you can rely on to get anything done. Some critics of Unity 4J say that we are trying to somehow say that everyone must work with us. That is not the case at all. From the beginning of these vigils, I've said repeatedly that people should be working on their own individually, or in whatever group that they find that they would like to work with. So I think that whatever it is that you can do, you should be doing, and do not feel powerless, because the only power any of us have ever had is in ourselves, and we have to use that agency to fight for Assange now more than ever.
That's right. That's right, Elizabeth. We can only do so much on these vigils. There are just a few of us. We have very interesting people that come on this vigil. We give great depth and understanding to the issues involved, but it's limited, the power that we have to affect government, U.S. government, particularly the Australian government and the British government. It has to be numbers and has to be sustained. Look back, there have been successful mass protests in history. A lot of people, sort of just dismiss the idea of protests as being a feel-good exercise. You get out there, you hold signs, you chant. And frankly, I've been a number of protests in my life, and I do feel good afterward. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about putting pressure on people in government to change a policy. And there are a couple examples I could point out right now where that worked in the US. For example, the right to vote for women. There were many, many and sustained and large protests in the streets of American cities. You can go and see pictures and video, even film of that during the 1920s, for suffrage, for women to be able to vote in the US. There were letters written, there were articles written, there were mass protests on the street of women marching, and they got the vote. Second, the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War came to an end mercifully after many, many years and millions of Vietnamese deaths of civilians. More than 50,000 American soldiers, Australian soldiers died. It was a disastrous war that the Pentagon Papers showed was based on a lie. The lie, what was the lie? The lie was the US government knew all along they couldn't win this war. Early on, they knew that. They kept it going to save face, essentially. The politicians knew they would be voted out, they would be humiliated if they turned tail and got the hell out. So they had to keep this absolutely unwinnable war going, particularly after the Tet Offensive. They continued this war, killing people, Americans and Vietnamese and others, in Cambodia and Laos as well, to save the Nixon presidency, for example. But it was during the Johnson administration and earlier that it was known the war was unwinnable, and Johnson doubled down and sent more troops. He could not face this. And this shows you how really criminal politicians can be when it comes to their own survival in office, when their own legacy, especially if you were the heights of the White House. The protests began in the mid-60s, and then as the late 60s and early 70s went. A whole day where Washington, D.C. was taken over basically by hundreds of thousands of protesters who marched across the Memorial Bridge and surrounded the Pentagon, where they could walk right up to the front door. They just jumped over a small wall. Now, if you go to the Pentagon, there are rings of parking lots and fences, and there's no way you can get anywhere near it. But in those days, you could go right up virtually to the door. There are incredible pictures of MPs with little rifles and their white helmets standing off against the protesters, where today these guys are in full riot gear and you can't get close. And that was a response to the fact that mass protest works, because the Vietnam War ended. It wasn't just the protest, but I think the protest drove the media. The U.S. media had initially supported that war 100%, the way they do virtually every war, no matter how unjust. Media supported that war until the Pentagon Papers were released and they themselves published the truth, which was U.S. government knew they could not win, and they kept it going. That helped spur more protests, and I think the protests then pushed the media against the war. Famously, the CBS anchorman Walter Cronkite, known to all Americans, had supported the war, and then he turned against it. And that's always cited by those who blame the media, in fact, for reporting on Vietnam the way they did eventually. That helped bring the war to the end, showing the power again of media. There were only 3 TV networks then in the U.S. They turned against the war. And there was another factor. War correspondents during the Second World War were not embedded by the government. They went there, and many were killed in Second World War and in Vietnam, reporting this war. But one big thing was different from Vietnam War and the Second World War were live color film, or not live rather, but filmed combat. That would be, the reels would be put in a case and flown back from from Saigon to New York to the studios of CBS. And within about 24 hours or so, when Americans were sitting down to dinner, they watched Americans getting shot and bleeding. That was on every single night. Americans on stretchers, bleeding, being put into helicopters. Americans firing guns and being fired at. They put an end to that in the first Gulf War, if you recall. George H.W. Bush, when the invasion of Kuwait was overturned by the American military, he said the Vietnam syndrome is over, something to that effect. What did he mean? That the country had turned against war, that the media had turned against war, and they were able to overturn that. And one way they did that was one of the reasons for that first Gulf War, in my opinion, to get militarism back on its feet, because it had stumbled, it was taken aback, it lost its footing because of the popular protests against the Vietnam War, engendered very much by the media, but I think the media was also influenced by the public outcry. That's their audience out there. And so when we're protesting, we're not just protesting for the government to change its policies, but for the media to wake up and defend the public's interest. That's what they're supposed to do, not the state's interest, which is what they're doing for the most part. And those protests were highly successful. There's another example. I'm going on because, first of all, we don't have another guest yet. So I have time to talk, and I'm going to bring Elizabeth in here. I don't want to shut her out, but I'm saying that a third example I can give is the campaign for nuclear disarmament in the 1980s. Massive protests in London and in Central Park in New York City. Huge numbers of people against nuclear weapons. Really a revival of the Vietnam era protests in the 1980s. And that led to, one could argue, to Reagan and Gorbachev meeting and actually coming up with arms control agreements. The ones that Trump are reversing right now, and then Bush did as well. So because one reason why is because we don't have those protests anymore. But there are 3 examples I gave. There's another one, fourth one, the civil rights movement in the United States. The marches in the South, led by Martin Luther King and others, and joined by northern white liberals who went down there, some of whom were killed when they went down there to support the civil rights. But that became a daily protest and an issue every night on the evening news. That helped drive Johnson to sign and Congress to pass the Civil Rights Act, which improved the rights of African Americans to vote in the United States. Of course, they had that legal right right after the Civil War, but they were always stopped through Jim Crow, which continued, including legal segregation, apartheid in the United States South, way up until that Civil Rights Act. It did not extinguish racism, unfortunately. We know that did not, but it did give, at least on paper, the right for African Americans to vote. That has also been overturned by the Supreme Court recently. I think it was during the Obama administration, where they overturned parts of that Civil Rights Act, which make it, again, easier to stop African Americans from voting. So we're going backward in so many ways from those days of civil rights movement, of the Vietnam War protests. And why are we going backward? Because we don't see these mass protests. And if there's ever been a good issue, an important and vital issue to protest again, it's the arrest of Julian Assange, because it's much larger than Julian Assange. This is about freedom of the press. Why is that important? Because that's about ultimately the fate of democracy. If we do not have a press that holds elected officials and other officials account, they will act with impunity. They acted with impunity in Vietnam until the people went into the streets. They acted with impunity to keep women from voting until women went into the streets. They acted with impunity to keep segregation, legal apartheid in the South going until people went in the streets. And they will put Assange in jail forever and muzzle the press and make other journalists liable to prosecution if people don't go out in the streets.
Absolutely. No, I agree. And I think one concerning aspect of what you're describing is that while we've moved backwards in terms of anti-war movements, we've moved backwards in terms of aspects of social equality and racism and those issues, we've seen a parallel progression in what I would call information warfare that, that people like Caitlin Johnstone would call narrative control. And especially in recent years and recent months and weeks, we've seen basically the pacification of the right wing that still supports Trump, wherein we have narratives that Assange is going to be helped by being extradited. We have narratives about, this being 4D, 8D, infinite D chess by Trump. And those, I believe, are the types of narratives that have been most effective in preventing those mass protests at the treatment of Assange by Trump's administration. I'm really serious about that. I think that if the right had not been pacified by these types of what I would call information warfare, there would be protests, there would be unrest. Why is it that in America we don't have a yellow vest movement as there is going on in France for the last 23, 25 weeks? I think that the American populace, the American public, are some of the most propagandized individuals on the planet. And I think that's what we have to fight. I think openly that's what we have to fight against. But moving backwards a little bit, going back to discussing the series that Consortium News will be publishing and moving to the subject of the Afghan war diaries, I just want to add that it's relevant to the current situation Assange faces, because in the instance of the Afghan war diaries, WikiLeaks, Assange, they worked with the New York Times, they worked with Der Spiegel, they worked with The Guardian. Those are three major outlets from three different countries. Now, if Assange and the Afghan war diaries were Manning era material, so Assange is being prosecuted right now specifically for trying to help Manning preserve her anonymity while accessing that material legally. But it is that same material she was accessing that was published jointly by or discussed by or were media partners of WikiLeaks, by the New York Times, Der Spiegel, and The Guardian. So what stops the United States Trump administration from then prosecuting the New York Times under the Espionage Act or The Guardian or Der Spiegel? Why is it that The Guardian has then turned on Assange and WikiLeaks and waged this awful, despicable war on WikiLeaks, publishing nonstop fake information about Assange? I just think that it's incredible to look back at those early publications that WikiLeaks did, the collaboration that they had from major outlets, and to put them in a category that says, oh no, this isn't journalism, this is espionage. That throws the New York Times, Der Spiegel, and The Guardian into that same box, because they were working directly with WikiLeaks on those specific publications that are at issue in Assange's prosecution. So I think, for that's one of the really relevant aspects of those early publications. In addition to, as I said earlier, the collateral murder video, it is not just relevant in terms of the fact that, like other WikiLeaks publications, it contains evidence of war crimes. But in addition to that, as I said earlier, it's something that we can sit down and watch. Even the extended full version is under an hour long. Whereas if you try to go through every single document that's in the Afghan war diaries, the Iraq war logs, or any other WikiLeaks publication, it would be, weeks, months, if not hours of full-time investigation to look through every single document. So in that sense, the collateral murder video is unique in its accessibility, and not just on an emotional level, but on a practical level. And that's why I think as well, it is one of the most important publications that WikiLeaks has released, because we can appreciate it in its entirety. Whereas it's basically humanly impossible to really access and assess every document that WikiLeaks published in other releases.
Absolutely.
And go ahead.
You raised the question, why is there no yellow vest movement in the United States? Well, there was the Occupy movement.
Right.
The Occupy movement was by Arab thing, particularly what happened in Cairo. And what happened in the Arab Spring was, in many ways, unleashed by the releases of WikiLeaks. In the State Department cables, the information that was revealed about Ben Ali, the leader of Tunisia, Tunisians themselves have credited that WikiLeaks release from stirring up the population to courageously oppose and depose eventually Ben Ali, who had a fleet of France. So that then spread to Egypt, which spread to Damascus, which spread to Libya and then to Damascus, and was what we now call the Arab Spring, which was crushed just the way Occupy was crushed, on a smaller scale Occupy. But that thing was tolerated for a while, and then the police moved in Zuccotti Park, in Lower Manhattan, in Wall Street. I was there. I saw it. I marched with them. I saw the police. They crushed it. By the way, it's interesting to note that during that period when Occupy was making a lot of noise and spread like wildfire really across the United States, because there were occupiers in Oakland and Seattle, all over the United States, we started seeing encampments. The Occupy movement then moved overseas. There was Occupy London and Berlin, etc. And one of the things the media did then, the corporate, capitalist, state-loving media did, was to write about how dirty these protesters were. They didn't clean up. They were defecating in the park. They were this and that. And, very similar to what we're hearing about Julian Assange. They focus on the personality of the person who's got a legitimate, vital message to put out. They will ignore that message, which is why we're running the Concerning series, because we are going to focus on that message, not on him. And they smear their personalities so that the public will not join them. Because if that went, I was going to say viral, but this is an on the street thing, not an online thing. If that spread beyond just the numbers, and they were quite large in New York and other places, in Oakland, I remember it was quite large in Oakland too. If that continued to spread to working class people, where unions started backing it. We look at 1968 in France. That's what really turned that thing into a mass movement, when the students and the labor unions formed an alliance. If Occupy had reached into the minds and the hearts of working people who were getting screwed under neoliberal policies, then the United States leaders would have had a huge problem on their hands. So what did they do? The same way that Mubarak and the others, and at the beginning Assad, and in Morocco and wherever there was the hint now of a protest, they went in and crushed it. And that's what the New York police did. That's what the police did in Oakland. That's what the police did in other places. They literally crushed this legal protest in a public square. That's what Zuccotti Park is. So they were there legally, but they went in anyway on some pretext or other that they were defecating there in the street or some nonsense. And of course, the press never highlighted the demands that the Zuccotti Park protesters had. I was down there often. I spoke with them. They had long lists of demands. It wasn't just about Wall Street. They talked about national health insurance. They talked about ending war. The press, if you read it, said they didn't have any agenda. They didn't know what they want. Even people on the so-called left were saying that. Well, they're not. They have a lot of people there, but they don't really know what they are demanding. It's not coherent. It was damn well coherent, but the media made sure it wasn't coherent by suppressing the message and focusing on their personalities. Now, maybe some guy did defecate in the park. I don't know. But that was certainly not representative of what was going on there. And this is the same thing with Julian now. They are, again, the damn media is talking about everything but what he published.
Exactly.
Talking about everything, every damn thing except what the Wall Street Occupier movement was saying. But that young people, in particular, across the country, but not only, understood what that was about. And that's why it spread. That's why they had to stop it. The FBI, we now know, was meeting with Wall Street executives to determine, and the New York police, to determine how to deal with this. And they didn't want to go in with force. Obviously, it doesn't look good, but they did. And they got away with it. And that's the history of mass protest in the United States. FBI and COINTELPRO, they infiltrated peace movements. They infiltrated African-American civil rights movements. The FBI under Hoover, who was there from 1925 until he died in 1972, the first I don't know how many administrations from 1925 until when the FBI was founded, he was the first director, and he lasted for a very long time until the Nixon administration. And this guy was, the closest thing America's had to an unelected dictator. He had information on every president and could blackmail all of them. To get his way. And the FBI is front and center in putting down protests, legal protests, if they start to threaten our leaders and try to pressure our leaders to change their policies. And I laid out 4 examples in American history from the 20th century in which mass protests changed U.S. policy. And he listened. Richard Nixon has said, I think on the tape, so we know somehow that he was pulling back the curtains in the White House to see Lafayette Park, the park right opposite the White House, to see the anti-war protesters. He heard their cries in the Oval Office. He heard the shouting. He heard the demonstrations, literally heard them. One night he went out at 3 a.m. He had his limousine stopped outside the Lincoln Memorial, and he got out and actually spoke to these young people to ask them what they wanted. That is one of the most extraordinary things I think that I know any president has ever done, let alone Richard Nixon. So he heard them and he wanted to hear them to the point where he went out to talk to them. Go on, Liz. Yeah, sorry.
Oh, no, I was just going to add that I think that as you're discussing that, after Hoover and as we've gone through the decades, I think that what you're describing is the progressive improvement of what we would, the establishment, whatever you want to call that, and that unelected power structure in combating and co-opting those types of movements from inside, as well as trying to repress them and attack them from the outside. And that's all I wanted to add.
That is the domestic side of that, and that's what the FBI does. CIA,
exactly.
All the other dirty tricks and shit goes on outside the country. Although the CIA has been definitely known to work within the U.S. too, illegally. We know that from the Church Committee report, something interesting to talk about, because that was also in that era of unrest and foment in the streets by the public, that the Congress, the Senate Intelligence Committee, actually began to investigate all the crimes, corruption of the FBI, the CIA, and the NSA from the time those agencies were founded, the CIA in 1947, and then the NSA in 1950, I believe. They unveiled and unleashed onto the public reams of data and information about what crimes the intelligence agencies had committed against the American people. That again took part because there were protests in the street, in my view. That pushed Congress. I said earlier, the media also pushed Congress against the war, because they were up for the re-election every 2 years in the House, every 6 years in the Senate. And when they saw the people out in the street, they said, damn, we got to listen. The way Nixon pulled his curtains back and went out to the Lincoln Memorial. So listen, so those people say protests don't work and it's only a feel-good thing. If it stays small, that might be true. The larger and more importantly, the more sustained that they are, we have seen results. That's why we need this again. And Assange is a focal point. There are many, many other issues that need to be protested about. The wars, the perpetual warfare, and that WikiLeaks has revealed. The economic policies. These are ripe for a protest right now. And the media is, again, focusing on the personalities and not on the issues. And that's one reason we're not seeing the mass protests we need. I wanted to welcome George Samueli to our broadcast, our webcast, I should say. George,
how are you?
How are you today?
Well, I was watching again the other day the interview that you did last week of Francis Boyle, and I was also wondering, what's your take on his analysis? Because I don't know extradition law that well, and so I was really stunned by his claim that it could all be wrapped up in a matter of days. And I was wondering whether either you or Elizabeth or Susie have heard from any lawyers to confirm that Boyle's analysis is actually correct, that it could just be wrapped up in a matter of days.
Well, from any other lawyers, because he is a lawyer. No,
yeah,
I have not heard that. I wasn't stunned by it, but I'm not convinced. Francis is a friend of mine. I hope he doesn't get offended if he hears this. But if he could be right, he could absolutely be right. He lays out a scenario where Assange will go to that May 2nd hearing, and that extradition court will say immediately, the way they did, by the way, in his bail hearing, it was over in minutes, basically, and say he's extraditable. And then they could appeal to the high court, and they could say he's extraditable, and then they could appeal to the Supreme Court. It's all in the same day, is what Boyle's saying. And then the Supreme Court could say he's extraditable, and then they turn it over to the Home Secretary. Now, the Home Secretary, there's also a debate about this. According to Boyle, the Home Secretary is the one who decides. What I've read, and I don't know what it says in terms of the actual law in Britain, that it's the Home Secretary just carries out the recommendation or the decision of the court. Either way, Boyle says that he will then have the Home Secretary, rubber stamp this, and he's on a plane back to the States. And a rendition plane that can be parked in Heathrow or in a military base somewhere in the UK, the US base in the UK, and he's in Alexandria prison, same prison where Manning is. I have no idea whether that's the case, whether that could happen. And he recommends, and I'm sure his lawyers know all this already, that they prepare now an appeal to the European Court of Human Rights. Britain is still in the UK, is still in the EU, which is crucial here, because they'd have to take.
I agree, it's crucial. But the British courts have ruled that they do follow the European Court of Human Rights rulings, but more they voluntarily do it. They are not obligated to follow the rulings of the European Court. So they agree to follow them, but they're not obligated to follow them.
Well, they have incorporated European human rights law into British law. That, for example, is why the Belmarsh prison have been holding terrorists, where Assange is right now, terrorists without charge for a long time. And it was the House of Lords that voted to correct that. So that's supposedly not happening now. But the point Boyle's making is not that Britain won't agree to the Human Rights Court in I guess in Strasbourg, Brussels. I'm not even sure where it's located, but that it could tie it up there for a year or so.
Right.
Well, I think Boyle's scenario it is a worst case scenario. I'm not a legal expert. I'm no lawyer, but I would say that I think that it's a worst case scenario we should take seriously, but that doesn't mean it's the way it's going to unfold.
Right. No, that's the impression I got. But I was a little shocked by that presentation of that worst case scenario. That in theory it could be wrapped up in a matter of days. And as a lawyer, I think lawyers have to always be prepared for the worst. I mean, it's just good practice.
I think we could add that's a scenario that the U.S. and the British governments would probably love to see happen.
Yes, absolutely.
They don't want it tied up in the courts for years or more. But whether that's going to happen or not remains to be seen. For everything else I've heard, except from Boyle, it's going to be tied up in the UK courts for a year or more. So let's obviously hope that that's the case. And he wouldn't have to necessarily serve his bail skipping sentence over, let's say, a year if he gets that, because the Americans have also arrested him and indicted him. They put out an arrest warrant for him, so he was arrested under both warrants. And so that he wouldn't have to serve that year in British prison. He could be back immediately in the U.S. Mm-hmm. So I think it all comes down to whether the Home Secretary decides or not. But this Home Secretary, clearly, from the statements he made in Parliament on the day of the arrest, is itching to get Assange.
Yeah. No. If it's thrown to the British government, then there's no question which way the British government's going to go. I mean, yeah, he's on the plane within 2 hours.
We need a courageous judge in the UK to say, no, the guy's ill. Number one, there have been cases of extradition hearings in the UK where someone who was ill was not extradited. And then there's the case of Laurie Love. I see Susie Dawson has joined us. I think Susie knows a hell of a lot more about the Laurie Love case than I do. It'd be interesting to see if you could compare the two. He, of course, was wanted on a hacking charge in the US. And as Assange is, even though it wasn't a hacking, but that's what the indictment basically says. And yet Laurie Love was not extradited. But Laurie Love was not Julian Assange either in terms of the impact.
Exactly. Yeah.
But the only reason that we know who Laurie Love is actually because of the advocacy of Julian Assange. It was Julian who identified the importance of Laurie's case. It was Courage Foundation who backed Laurie Love and organized the support campaign for him that ultimately prevented that extradition. And I think personally, Julian doesn't get enough credit for the number of journalists, truth tellers, hacktivists, whistleblowers whose cases he has intervened in and made a material difference to. Laurie Love is the first person to give credit to Julian Assange for that. Laurie has consistently supported Julian and attributed the favourable outcome of his case to Julian's efforts, which I think is admirable that he's such a loyal friend to Julian. But that is something that has greatly concerned me all along, which is I feel that the sacrifice of Julian physically endangers future journalists, whistleblowers, hacktivists who won't have his support, his organizational structure, and his advocacy, just as we saw him advocate for Catalonian activists and many others. Amin Husseinov is a publisher in Azerbaijan whose life was saved by an intervention from Julian and WikiLeaks, who helped him to obtain and to get to Switzerland, where he was granted asylum thanks to their efforts. So I think I've said many times before, and I'll say again, I believe that to save the life of Julian Assange is to save the life of many, many people in the future. George, in response to your question, I too hope that Francis Boyle was wrong. I can't say that he is wrong. I agree entirely with Elizabeth that we have to take it seriously and seriously consider that perhaps he is right. I know that the legal team have received other legal opinions from other sources that do differ from Francis's, but I'm struck by something that Christine Assange told me. She said, nothing is out of bounds when it comes to Julian. Nothing can be taken for granted. No process goes the way that it's meant to. No process or law is respected when it comes to Julian Assange. His case is just different. It's different to anything that has come before, and the way that it's handled and the way that the authorities respond to it is different to anything else. And so we simply can't say this law will protect him or that law will protect him or this process will protect him, because we've seen over and over and over again the willingness of these powers to violate their own process and to disregard their own laws, their own constitutions, and international law as well.
Yes.
So
yeah,
that's what I'd say on that front.
Yeah. No, that's right. I mean, storming into the embassy and just seizing him in that way. I mean, it's, what kind of law was the British government following there? I mean, the man was an Ecuadorian citizen. So you have to go through a legal process. I mean, in other words, if it's true that they had withdrawn the asylum from him, then the British government issues a warrant, and then it has to go through the Ecuadorian courts. There is a legal process. You don't just storm into an embassy and just grab someone. So, the British government follows no laws. I mean, just invents the laws as it goes along, even as it's talking about the value-based system that the Western governments uphold. So yeah, no, I agree entirely that they're just going to invent things along the way in order to nail him.
Thank you for your comic relief, George, with that remark about the value-based system that the West follows. Quite fun.
Joe, I thought you were spot on. I was just listening to you talk before about Occupy, and I thought it was quite brilliant of you to draw the parallels between the specific narratives that were employed by the media against Occupy movement and the narratives that are employed against Julian. It's something that I hadn't put two and two together on myself, but I also want to tell you, having been there in person on the ground, we also had media in New Zealand claim that our occupation was unsanitary, and that there were, people were defecating on the ground, which is completely untrue. But what they didn't mention is that the Auckland City Council had first locked all the public toilets and prevented any access to sanitation. Then, as if that wasn't enough, they cut off the water supply to the occupation to prevent us having any access to clean water. And then they physically removed portable toilets that we had placed around the occupation. So, and then they reported that our occupation was terribly unsanitary and a public health risk. So it's not just that these narratives are untrue, misleading, and nasty smears, which they are, but too often the behind the scenes, the authorities are actually deliberately engineering a situation to manifest the complaints that they're making. It was a similar situation with the grass. They said that we had done hundreds of thousands of dollars of damage to the grass, that the tent stakes had penetrated the bedding underneath the lawns on the grounds. And we found at the end of the occupation, we actually went and spread grass seed around. I think we spent about $160 on grass seed. And we were able to regrow all the grass and leave it in exactly the same condition it was when we found it. So this hundreds of thousands of dollars of damage never manifested, but it was a narrative that was used against us throughout. And I think the same thing has happened with Julian. I'd like to talk actually about a couple of the images that we've seen, and I hope that Christine will not mind me sharing some of the information that I know behind those images. So we saw images of Julian cooking in the kitchen on a portable stove, and the media claimed that the embassy staff were terribly bothered by him leaving his cooker going over the weekend, as if this was some kind of danger, like he's going to burn down the embassy or something. Well, I happen to know for a fact that the cooker that he was using was a slow cooker. So it's a special insulated cooker for making stews, so that he can have a decent amount of food still at enough of a temperature that it's not going to spoil, but a low enough temperature so it's actually no danger to anybody whatsoever, let alone to the embassy. It's a totally normal piece of cookware that almost anybody would have in their kitchen. And the reason that he was cooking stews, there was a bit more to that as well. I happen to know that his mother had been finding special recipes for him, for dishes that he could cook that would provide him with some of the missing nutrients that his body needed. So the reason I know this is because when I was diagnosed with an autoimmune disorder last December, Christine actually sent me those same recipes and sent me out to buy a slow cooker, which I did. And I've been making myself these stews, because when you cook meat over a long period of time, you extract the gelatin and other nutrients from the bones that then nourish the body in a different way to if you just get brought some takeout food in or whatever else Julian was having to rely on prior to that. So when we see these images of Julian cooking in the kitchen, it's literally a form of physical therapy to try to strengthen and nourish him in the situation that he's in. And yet this completely normal act of using a slow cooker and cooking a stew gets presented as if it's some mortal danger to the embassy and some shocking revelation. I'd also like to speak about the images we've seen of him skateboarding inside the embassy. Why Julian was skateboarding wasn't because he's some strange lost youth that wants to, revisit his childhood of skateboarding. What he was trying to do was to experience the sensation of motion. Because when you're stuck in one place and you have no experience of motion, it was one of the things he talked about some time ago was having been brought a treadmill to run on. But it was aggravating him psychologically, because he would run and run and run, but never feel that he was moving anywhere, because he was on the spot. He had no physical sensation of moving from one space to another. So when he was on the skateboard, what he was trying to do is to stimulate his senses to feel, to experience the feeling of motion. So that was an act, that was for his health. He was literally skateboarding in the embassy for his psychological health, just as he was cooking in the slow cooker for his physical nourishment. And I think Caitlin Johnston made a really great point, where she said if he was doing deranged things in the embassy, then that would be a result of the psychological pressure, the mental pressures of his situation. And then what does it make us to mock somebody who's experiencing that? What does it make us to mock someone who is having detrimental impacts to their mental health as a result of their situation? We have these mental health awareness weeks and World Mental Health Day, and we're supposed to be so understanding and kind towards people who are having these valid experiences, and yet we would mock and laugh at somebody trying to experience motion on a skateboard or trying to physically nourish themselves with nutrients from using a slow cooker? Like, is that what we've become? And I thought that was a really pertinent point. Now, I can't stick around very long tonight, but I wanted to take the viewers on a little trip down memory lane. So I wrote an article. Oh, okay. Hold on 1 second. Oh, no, I'm sorry. That was for someone else, this message. So I wrote an article last year called Being Julian Assange, and that article attempted to correct many misnomers about the historical record of WikiLeaks. But there were a few things that I didn't put in that article, not deliberately, but just things that since I've realized are missing from that are very pertinent given the conversations that are going on at the moment. So one of those I think is extremely important in the context of Sweden. So we keep hearing yet again about Sweden. This is being dragged up. And somehow the media concentrating on Sweden has led a lot of people to believe that Julian was only actively targeted or hunted as a result of the Swedish situation, that the Swedish situation was really the beginning of his troubles. That's how it's presented to us. And so I just wanted to point something out to you all. And that's that if you go online and you look up Jacob Appelbaum 2010 Hope Conference, NYC, it's the Hackers on Planet Earth conference in New York City. Jacob Appelbaum appeared in Julian Assange's place at that conference on July the 7th of 2010, 6 weeks prior to the incidents in Sweden. The reason that Jacob Appelbaum appeared on Julian's behalf is because the Pentagon had already issued a manhunt notice on Julian Assange. The FBI and the Department of Homeland Security were already searching for him. And you can actually go on YouTube and watch Jacob Appelbaum's keynote speech. And you can see him call out, I believe it was 7 Department of Homeland Security agents who stormed into that event looking for Julian Assange. And Jacob Appelbaum, at the end of his speech, actually had a doppelganger dressed as him leave through the main theater while Jacob Appelbaum took off out the back door of the theater because he was so concerned that he was going to be arrested and detained simply for having spoken in Julian Assange's place. So the fact that the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security and the Pentagon were launching this global manhunt for Julian Assange 6 weeks prior to the Swedish incidents completely reframes the context of the situation that Julian was in 2010. And the idea that he was only wanted for any issue relating to Sweden is a complete and utter fallacy. They were after him 6 weeks prior to that. And I mean, that was why Julian had been forced to move from European country to European country. So I wanted to make that point to people. It's actually an incredibly important keynote speech that is given at that event. So if our social media mods could look up on YouTube, Jacob Appelbaum Hope Conference 2010, and spread that link around. Jacob talks on the stage about the extent to which he and other WikiLeaks associates are being hunted and persecuted by these agencies. And it's just such important context. And I feel like that's the message we need to be getting out. Every time we hear about Sweden, as if Sweden is the beginning of the problems, we need to be circulating that conference speech. We need to make it clear that Julian was being hunted.
And it's also very important to keep in mind that Sweden, after 9 years, still hasn't brought any charges against him. So when Jeremy Corbyn and all these holier-than-thou Labour MPs start talking about, women's rights and, we can't have anyone getting away with sexual assault and, these are serious charges that Julian Assange must answer, then they've got to address the issue. Well, if they were so terrible, if these charges are so serious, how come 9 years? They've had 9 years They've interviewed everybody, including Julian Assange, and they still haven't brought any criminal charges. So, you can't just keep saying, well, these are terribly serious charges. Why hasn't Sweden then brought these charges? I mean, so obviously the Swedish authorities don't really think that they've got much of a case, and it's not a case that they can win. And in fact, why has Sweden wanted to drop the case? Sweden wanted to drop the case in 2013, and they were prevented from doing so by the British. So all these Labour MPs, think that they're going to win some brownie points with the feminists, are already pathetic.
Well, we know that the initial prosecutor assigned to the Swedish cases dropped the cases because they said that they lacked merit and that there was no rape. We know that one of the women herself said that there was no rape, that she was not raped. And the other one had supplied a condom as evidence, which it was proven did not contain Julian Assange's DNA. But aside from that, there are two very important public voices about the events in Sweden, and that is Naomi Wolf is one of them. And the second is a UK-based group called Women Against Rape. Both Naomi Wolf and Women Against Rape are public anti-rape advocates, anti-sexual violence advocates. And they have both, twice now, the group Women Against Rape have posted op-eds about the situation in Sweden. And Naomi Wolf also herself posted a very important one. And again, to our social media mods, if you could look up those op-eds and share them in the chat, it's really important for people to read. So what Naomi Wolf says is that the way that this case was handled in Sweden, where Julian, prior to having been charged with anything, already woke up to find the entire world media branding him a rapist without charges having been laid, because the police had made these leaks to the tabloid papers, which had then spread around the world. That this is not how rape cases are handled. This is not what happens to men, especially men in power, who are accused of rape or of sexual violence. That this is not the experience of women who actually are raped. We don't go to police stations and discover that justice is meted out within 24 hours. This is not how it works. This is not the process. Women are notoriously re-traumatized across months and years by police agencies who are usually very reticent to investigate, let alone to charge. Only 5% of cases are ever prosecuted. Only 1% ever result in convictions. And so Naomi Wolf and Women Against Rape both talk about the discrepancies between how genuine rape victims are treated by the police and the judicial processes versus what we've seen in Sweden. But like I said, with Julian already being a target of the Pentagon, already being hunted by the FBI and the DHS nearly 2 months prior, I think it completely recontextualizes the issue around Sweden. We also know, and as has been pointed out over the last week, that the Swedish prosecutors destroyed their entire case file. They confirmed that they had destroyed all of their emails in their case file. So this idea that they can just pick it all up again is actually ludicrous and ridiculous, and only the uninformed believe that. So I just have one more.
Is that right? They destroyed the case file?
They destroyed the case file. So we know this because Stefania Maritzi and others have been fighting in the UK courts to get disclosure. And they were told that they couldn't get disclosure because the emails were deleted. And Marianne Nye said that she had destroyed the case file, which is completely ludicrous and ridiculous. But that they've stated that in court, that all of the correspondence throughout the years has been destroyed and the case file has been destroyed, over finished. So this idea that these 70 MPs are telling them to reopen the case that they don't have because they literally physically destroyed the documents is almost laughable. But like I said, it's something that's being asserted by the uninformed. So I've got to go really shortly, and I know that there's other people waiting to speak. There's just one more thing that I wanted to talk about. And that's that I think that too often people underestimate the danger faced by WikiLeaks sources. And I've seen this week some people I describe as unsavory discounting the idea that any WikiLeaks source could ever be murdered or come to any physical harm, as if everything's okay. And so I wanted to take you guys back in time to before collateral murder, to several years before collateral murder, because while collateral murder made WikiLeaks famous, it was not the first WikiLeaks revelation that put a source in serious danger. And by that, I mean, in Manning's case of having been ratted out by the FBI informant Adrian Lamo, and then having been held in a military prison and tortured. I want to talk briefly about Kenya. And I think that the best thing I can do is to read directly from the WikiLeaks statement about the matter, because this is the first known, confirmed event where WikiLeaks sources were assassinated for their work with WikiLeaks. So I'm going to read from this press release by WikiLeaks. It's on their wiki. March the 8th, 2009. On Thursday afternoon, Oscar Kamo Kingara, director of the Kenyan-based Oscar Legal Aid Foundation, and his program coordinator, John Paul Ulo, were both shot dead at close range in their car less than a mile from President Kibaki's residence. The two were on their way to a meeting at the Kenyan National Commission on Human Rights. Both had been investigating extrajudicial assassinations by the Kenyan police. Part of their work forms the basis of the Cry of Blood report that WikiLeaks released on November 1st, 2008, and subsequent follow-ups, including a UN indictment last month. Since 2007, the Oscar Foundation has documented 6,452 enforced disappearances by police and 1,721 extrajudicial killings. The murders come just 2 weeks after United Nations Special Rapporteur on Extrajudicial Killings, Professor Philip Alston, called on Kenya's Attorney General and Police Commissioner to be sacked. On 18th of February 2009, the Oscar Foundation presented its findings for use in a parliamentary debate. The Oscar Foundation vehicle was blocked by a minibus and a Mitsubishi Pajero vehicle, both of which had been following them along State House Road. Several men were in the two vehicles. Two men got out, approached the vehicle of Oscar Kamo Kingara and John Paul Ulo, and shot them through the windows at close range. According to eyewitnesses, the driver of the minibus was in a police uniform, while the other men were wearing suits. The closest eyewitness to the incident was also shot in the leg and later taken away by policemen. A coalition of civil society organizations have released a statement blaming police for the murders. These were very decent men who had done more work than anybody in examining police killings, said Cyprian Nyamwamu, the executive director of the National Convention Executive Council, an NGO advocating social and economic reform. I have no doubt that this is why they were killed. And the statement continues, and I'm just going to share the screen here for a moment, and you can see this is photos of the men and of the killing and the scene of the killing. And this is the WikiLeaks press release. WikiLeaks then was raising funding for a reward for the conviction or apprehension of the assassins and those behind them, and had established a special fund to do so. Now, being that this is 2 years, more than 2 years, prior to the Pentagon manhunt and the FBI and DHS storming the Hope Conference in NYC, hoping to track down and arrest Julian Assange, you get some idea from this of the severity of the danger faced by those who worked on releases like these. And you also start to get an understanding that WikiLeaks wasn't just revealing information about people killed in Iraq and Afghanistan and war zones. They were shining light on extrajudicial killings around the world. We know that they have in Latin America, and here they had in Africa. WikiLeaks was indiscriminate in its revelations of injustice, regardless of where that injustice originated from. And so I just wanted to make that point. So when people mock mock the idea that WikiLeaks sources or that WikiLeaks themselves and WikiLeaks associates are severely targeted or endangered. I think that this quite viscerally shows us the reality of the situation, that even before WikiLeaks was a household name, people who were associated with shining light on injustice through activities with WikiLeaks were paying for it with their lives. And that's all I wanted to bring to your attention tonight. I'll hand it back to you, Joe.
No, I think that's that's an excellent point, and it's interesting that Mueller in his report makes this whole issue that Julian Assange brought up the Seth Rich only in order to throw off suspicion from the true culprits, namely the Russians. Now, of course, Mueller has no idea what Assange was doing, since Mueller never bothered to go interview him. So, this is amazing, his ability to read Assange's mind. But also, Mueller was just operating on the assumption which was provided for him by his pal Comey, who in turn was informed by what's the name? What was the company that the Democrats hired in order to what was that?
CrowdStrike.
CrowdStrike, exactly. So CrowdStrike provided them with that info about the that it was all the Russians who hacked it, and the FBI just said, yeah, cool, we accept all this. And Mueller also said, yeah, cool, we accept it. And Mueller says this in his report. He doesn't, he's not ambiguous about this. We did no investigation of our own. We just simply accepted what the FBI told us. So all this stuff about, it can't possibly be Seth Rich, and then what are these terrible Seth Rich conspiracies? Well, you'd have to assume that Julian Assange is lying. He doesn't have a terribly good track record on lying. I mean, he's never been caught out on a lie. So to say he's lying, you got to prove. Has he ever lied about anything? I don't know of any case.
Well, before we bring in Alice Thompson, I just wanted to add to that, George. Mueller's pal Comey also testified under oath that they believed, that the FBI believed, that Assange hacked emails from Russia through an intermediary, cutout as they use in the intelligence trade. That means that Assange would not have known that Russia had hacked the emails. If in fact, it was this cutout. They wouldn't send a Russian cutout there. If they didn't want Assange to know what the origin was, they would have sent somebody else, maybe an American, who knows, to give him the emails. So also, it says in the Mueller report that Guccifer 2.0 and DC leaks that Mueller contends were front names for the GRU, the Russian intelligence, communicated with Assange, and they did, and sent these files, and they gave a file name, but no forensic evidence to back it up, sent these files to Assange. How would Assange know if this, assuming all that's correct, how would Assange know that Guccifer 2.0 and DC leaks were fronts for the GRU?
Yeah.
2.0
said he was a Romanian hacker. Maybe that's what he.
It's totally irrelevant, because I'm going to share with you a timeline that was pointed out today. Julian Assange's first public statement, it certainly wasn't the first private conversation, but the first public statement that they would be publishing information from Hillary Clinton was on June the 12th. The Guccifer 2 persona didn't exist until June the 16th, and Mueller says that the first communications were between WikiLeaks and Guccifer 2 were on the 22nd of June 2016.
Right.
So WikiLeaks had already confirmed that they would be releasing information on Hillary and the DNC prior to the existence of Guccifer 2 and prior to the existence of any communications between them. But the DNC leaks were actually foreshadowed by Kim.com in, I believe, either November or December of 2015, which was the subject of some controversy, as some people felt he shouldn't have been discussing that when he did. But actually, there was discussion for months and months prior that something was coming on Hillary and the DNC long before Gusev 2 was ever dreamed up. And I'd just like to point out one other interesting fact is that Sean, God, what's his name? His name escapes me at the moment. It was the ex-assistant director for the FBI who left the FBI and became the senior executive at CrowdStrike, was the handler, when he was at the FBI, was the handler of Hector Sabu Monsegur, who's one of the most disgusting people on this planet. It's an FBI snitch who is responsible for the jailing of Jeremy Hammond, the hacktivist who supplied WikiLeaks with the GI files. So FBI agents who had been going after WikiLeaks and WikiLeaks sources and associates in their career at the FBI then transitioned to the private sector and continued activities to discredit and stitch up WikiLeaks.
Those are great additions to what I was saying, Susie. That is a third and a fourth reason why, well, the third one, as you point out, that Julian said that on June 12, 2016, in that ITV interview in London, that they had emails on Clinton, and then Christopher shows up later by Mueller's own timeline. So those are three examples of why there's no way Julian would know, even if it were the Russians, and there's huge doubts that there was the Russians that hacked it. It could have been a leak, as the VIPs say. There's three reasons why Julian would not know that it were the Russians, if it were indeed the Russians that gave him the emails. And yet, of course, this is only being discussed here on Unity for J Vigil, not on MSNBC, last I saw.
Right.
Alistair.
And not by Mueller. And there, I'd just like to point out that the best source for information on this topic is Julian Assange. There is a video here I have tweeted out. I'll show you my tweet so that you guys can go and look it up. I've said this is the smoking gun video from 2016. A full interview of Julian Assange with Afshin Ratansi on going underground inside the Ecuadorian embassy. The Mueller investigation has falsely been conflating three separate DNC breaches as being one: the Russians, Gusev 2.0, and WikiLeaks, but they were separate penetrations all along, as Julian Assange explains here. Now, in that video, Julian says he does believe that the Russians had penetrated multiple political parties in the United States, and that is a matter of due course, that this is essentially their job, as is the job of every intelligence service, and certainly, as we've seen, the US and the Five Eyes have done in multiple elections. We've literally seen the dispatch orders for the espionage orders for Five Eyes agents to do that. Snowden also said, when Snowden was first asked about Russiagate, Snowden said, well, this is the job of these agencies. Their job is to penetrate foreign, anyone who's of influence in the politics of foreign countries. What Julian says is he believes Russia did penetrate it, but that it had absolutely nothing to do with WikiLeaks releases, that WikiLeaks source was not the Russian government, that it was completely unrelated, how they'd sourced their material. And he also says that the Gusev, he confirms that the Gusev 2.0 was not the material published by WikiLeaks.
Right. That was even pointed out in a New Yorker article. Sorry, I just knew that, in fact, Gusev 2.0 really didn't have very much material. So the stuff that Gusev 2.0 just released was just a load of crap. I mean, so therefore that was just a red herring.
I want to add one thing.
My recollection at the time was that
just one more point about Julian Assange's motive in releasing the DNC and Podesta emails. What he said, it was clearly to uncover the corruption in the Clinton campaign. If that were accepted by the DNC and by Hillary Clinton, I mean, then where would they go with that? They would have to admit that they were corrupt. And in fact, the resignation of Deborah Wasserman-Schultz as the head of the DNC and others showed that the releases were true. So what they had to do was they had to blame it on Russia, because they had to smear Assange by saying he had dealings with Russia. Otherwise, they would have to accept the real motive that Assange has laid out, which is the truth, that he was just trying to expose their corruption. They couldn't accept that. They had to come up with another explanation, and Russia was the explanation. Alistair, please welcome.
It's a pleasure to be back. So, I mean, I think all of this is sort of kind of beside the point. I mean, I mean, obviously, we do have the problem with there being multiple pieces of misinformation being spread about all aspects of this, but we don't. And if we go back to the DC Leaks situation, the DC Leaks operation seemed to be incredibly disorganized and sort of, I don't know, badly arranged, and the material was. I mean, Mueller sort of suggests that DC Leaks had done a whole lot of sort of, I don't know, exclusive releases of information, but it was all terribly done. It was just all catastrophic until the WikiLeaks stuff came out. And when the WikiLeaks stuff out, it was well organized. It was delivered with superb timing, and the media jumped on it extremely effectively. And we saw Debbie Wasserman Schultz disappear sort of very, very rapidly. And there seems to be this. I mean, that whole argument just seems to me a complete red herring in relation to what we're concerned with here at the moment, which is, what is the British government currently doing that is illegal?
Well, Al, excuse me, you've just joined us. We spent the first hour and a half talking
about that. Yeah. So I mean, I missed some of that discussion, and I'm curious to get a bit of an update on that, because obviously we've now got the UN person has managed to get in there. I mean, at the risk of repeating material which has been talked about already, I mean, there may be people that are joining this stream a bit later.
Yeah, well, we discussed kind of touchy, the UN rapporteur on privacy, that he went to see Julian and Belmarsh, and Stefania Morisi, the Italian journalist, El Repubblica, interviewed her and did a Q&A with him, which we read out, the entire thing. And we also discussed with George, when he came on, what the opinion of Francis Boyle was, an international lawyer at the University of Illinois that we had on last week. And he believes that the extradition of Assange would take place within a day. On the day of the hearing, the next day he could be on a plane, and he laid it out that the High Court, Supreme Court, and the Home Secretary would all immediately say he's extraditable and he'd be gone. And we were questioning that. We don't know.
That seems very unlikely. I mean, for legal reasons. I mean, it would. But I mean, we have seen stuff that has been very strange. I mean, one of the things that struck me was that the remarks that the judge made on the day of the arrest were just extraordinary. I mean, calling someone in the dock a narcissist when he's jumped bail on the basis of no evidence whatsoever is just absurd. I mean, that judge was not a judge. I mean, the whole thing was extremely peculiar. I mean, and I don't think it's unlikely. I would have thought that even if the Home Secretary wants to do that it would be possible to do that. I mean, the Supreme Court isn't going to play a patsy for this. Certainly not in the country, which is as sort of. I mean, their constitutional processes are already in a complete mess. But I mean, that said, I mean, what was truly shocking to me was the fact that he was being held incommunicado for so long, and I don't understand how that could have possibly happened. I mean, what possible justification there could have been?
Well, that's why we have to worry that they might not go through their normal processes. They haven't here, as Susie pointed out. Christine Assange said that everything in terms of legal processes when it comes to Julian Assange's case have not been followed, and we could expect anything to happen. And that's why Boyle may be right, because normally, of course, that wouldn't happen. But this is not a normal case.
Jennifer Robinson has been able to see him, though, I presume.
First day. I think the first day he was in prison, she went to see him, because she went on TV and later said that.
And not since then, or?
Not since.
Or as you...
Susie knows more about this, but I think, he's not seen his lawyers. He's had apparently teleconferences with his lawyers, and there's going to be an appointment, and it may have been today in London on the 26th, that, by the way, those teleconferences or telephone calls are subject to being spied on, whereas an in-person interview with the lawyer is much more difficult in a prison where there's supposed to be attorney-client privilege, but we know they violated that inside the embassy. When Assange was meeting with his lawyers, that was surveilled, and we saw evidence of that in that case that we also discussed, where Spain was three thugs in Spain were trying to extort 3 million euros from WikiLeaks by showing them some of the evidence they had of all the surveillance tapes, including meetings with his lawyer. So, Susie, do you know if that took place today, that meeting? Was it today that he was supposed to see them in person?
I believe it was scheduled. I believe it was scheduled today, and I think that some people were quite confused about the order of events this week in relation to the public statements that were made about whether or not Julian had access to his lawyers. I'll just quickly recount that for you. Christine Assange had confirmed with the heads of his legal team and also with certain officials that he had not had access to them. So that her statement was entirely correct, and she consulted with the legal team prior to her making that public statement that he had not. As a result of her public statement, it got 5,000 retweets. People raised hell about it. There were all kinds of people calling the prison and making a noise about it. And next thing we knew, the prison, who were not approving any meeting until May 1st, which would be one day prior to Julian's next court hearing, had brought that forward by 5 days. And then Christine tweeted an update yesterday saying that, yes, now Julian is having meetings with his lawyers and is in touch with them, and that's great. And she specifically said she wanted to thank everybody who raised their voices about that issue and helped to apply pressure. And shortly after her statement, WikiLeaks tweeted out an update saying, yes, now Julian, and the key word being now Julian has is able to meet with his lawyers, and they'll be meeting in person on the 26th. So yes, I do believe that went ahead. Now,
How did they justify his not being able to see his lawyer? What was the justification that all this time went by?
I don't think there is any. I don't think they had any justification.
And
I don't think they had. They just simply don't approve it. I mean, it's very much like the Ecuadorian embassy. You know, the UN rapporteur requested to meet on torture, requested to meet with Julian in the embassy. We know that the embassy simply didn't authorize that meeting. So I'd say that the prison simply wasn't authorizing that meeting. So that's conjecture on my part. It's assumption on my part based on the conduct that we've seen leading up to this. Now, I'm really sorry, but I do have to love you and leave you guys. But I just wanted to point out something, and that's that in chat, when before I was talking about the mortal risk that some sources and associates of WikiLeaks have faced, or the risk to their liberty in the case of Ola Binney in Ecuador, who's currently detained without charge for association with WikiLeaks. Our viewers raised the issue of Michael Hastings. We know that Michael Hastings was a top investigative reporter for both Rolling Stone and for BuzzFeed. And we know that within 24 hours of him reaching out to WikiLeaks, actually to Jen Robinson, Julian's lawyer, and saying that he believed he was under aggressive FBI surveillance and that he was at risk, within 24 hours of that, he was dead in a extremely suspicious fiery crash on the Los Angeles Boulevard. And people mentioned that Michael Hastings, at the time of his death, had been investigating then CIA Director John Brennan, but they didn't know. They said that they didn't know. No one knows what it was precisely that Michael Hastings was investigating in relation to Brennan, because that story never came out. It was supposed to come out after his death, and it never eventuated. Well, actually, we do know what it was that Michael Hastings was investigating about Brennan prior to his death, and I would just like to quickly bring that up for you here. So just to give you some idea of John Brennan's animus, John Brennan's what I call insane psychopathic obsession with hurting Julian and WikiLeaks is because in 2011, the WikiLeaks Stratford GI files proved that he was hunting journalists. And WikiLeaks then embarrassed Brennan by saving Snowden, because of course Brennan was the CIA director during the Snowden revelations and the Snowden affair. And then in 2015, WikiLeaks published Brennan's personal emails. But just with regards to Michael Hastings specifically, we know that John Brennan, the ex-CIA director, was being investigated by American journalist Michael Hastings when his car blew up on a Los Angeles Boulevard. He had been investigating Brennan for targeting journalists. And who had exposed that fact? It was WikiLeaks. So if we look here, here we have it. Here's the source. Michael Hastings was investigating Brennan's crackdown on investigative journalists before his death. And that source is reason.com, and you can find that on my timeline. I'll retweet it now so it'll be at the top of my timeline. And of course, there's a specific GI files image, which I thought I had here somewhere. This looks like it. Here it is. The GI files was, email was titled Obama Leak Investigations, Internal Use Only, Please Do Not Forward. And the text reads, Brennan is behind the witch hunts of investigative journalists learning information from inside the Beltway sources, which is precisely a description of Michael Hastings, because Michael Hastings was getting information from inside Beltway sources and publishing it. Note, there is a specific tasker from the White House to go after anyone printing materials negative to the Obama agenda. Even the FBI is shocked. The Wonder Boys must be in meltdown mode. That was 21st of September 2010, which is less than a month after Sweden and is about 3 months after the FBI and DHS showed up at a Hope conference in New York City trying to apprehend Julian Assange. So I'll leave it at that. So yes, the people in chat who mentioned it, you are completely right that Michael Hastings is yet another example of a strong WikiLeaks supporter and advocate and associate, and possibly would have become a source of WikiLeaks had he not been killed. Thank you for raising that issue.
Susie, before you go, I mean, I'd like you to address the Seth Rich issue, because I mean, that's the most prejudicial information which has been sort of broadcast non-stop on American media about the Mueller report, and particularly the interview that he gave. Now, what's his explanation for that? Or is there an explanation?
What is Julian Assange's, are you saying what is Julian Assange's explanation for that?
Yeah.
Well, Julian didn't explain that because Julian will never talk about whether someone is or isn't a source. So the fact that
why did he suggest that it was? I mean, he sort of, in that interview, he sort of repeatedly hints that perhaps Seth Rich has been murdered because he's a source. He doesn't say that he is, but he doesn't say that he's not either. I mean, it's not, and I don't think that that's. I mean, if that was misdirection, that would be perfectly appropriate too.
Oh, I doubt that he would misdirect using, over the dead body of someone if they were completely unrelated. I mean, we've just given the context, which is that multiple people who were affiliated with or who were sources for WikiLeaks had already paid with their lives in prior years, dating back to 2008. That was the purpose, actually, of me giving my little speech tonight about Kenya and about the forgotten history of WikiLeaks and the danger faced by WikiLeaks sources. And
so do we still seriously think it is possible that Seth Rich was the source?
I don't think that we can say Seth Rich was the source or wasn't the source, but what I think we can do is we can look at the data points, okay? So here's a couple of data points for you. Craig Murray has spoken to this issue, has openly said that he was involved as a courier in supplying that information and getting information to WikiLeaks from the true source of the DNC leaks, and that source wasn't Russia. So you have to look at whether you believe Craig Murray is credible. I personally find him to be extremely credible, ex-diplomat. This is not the type of accusation someone would, or claim that someone would make lightly. I know that others who were with him at an event in Washington, D.C. at that time that he says that he was the courier for that information, have confirmed that he was there within the time frame he says he was in the place that he says he was, and that it may well have been the case that he did in fact do that. So that's one data point. The next data point that I'd look at is what Kim.com had to say. So Kim.com, as I said, made the public statements about Hillary and the DNC in late 2015, 6 months prior to the DNC publications, and long before any manifestation of Guccifer 2.0 or anything else, or any allegations against Russia. I wrote an article called, it's on contraspin.co.nz. It's called "Someone is Lying to Seth Rich's Family About Kim.com." I suggest that anybody who's seriously interested in Kim.com, Kim says that he was in contact with Seth Rich. And this article completely deconstructs the public narratives around Kim.com's involvement and Seth Rich's family. I seriously suggest that you go and have a look at that. Contraspin.co.nz. Someone is lying to Seth Rich's family about Kim.com. There are mountains of related source material that I've compiled there. And I was tangentially involved with some of the events and can corroborate some of it, which I do in that article. I believe Kim's telling the truth. I don't believe that he made it up. I don't believe that he was blowing smoke, at the end of 2015. I believe he did possess information. I don't think that Craig Murray is lying. Can I say certainly that Seth Rich was the source? No, I can't, and I wouldn't. And Julian clearly wouldn't violate WikiLeaks' own rules around revealing a source, but Julian is also highly likely to be concerned if someone who may have been associated with WikiLeaks has paid with their life yet again. I mean, people fail to put themselves in Julian's shoes. What I discussed about Kenya alone, Julian already knew what it was like to lose sources. He knew what it was like.
Yeah. So I mean, that all makes perfect
work
sense.
With people who showed up dead.
And I mean, that makes perfect sense. And at the time that this was happening, how would Julian have been able to check with any degree of, he wouldn't be able to know for certain whether. I mean, he might not have known if Seth was the source. There's another possibility as well.
Julian's never going to relate. He's never going to talk about sources or methods. I mean, just as the intelligence community always scream about sources and methods, WikiLeaks has that same practice. They will protect their sources and their methods. And I think that I personally believe one of the reasons that the CIA and others want their hands on Julian isn't just retribution and isn't just the public desecration of him, but is actually they want to get their hands on his sources and methods. I don't believe that they have access to them.
That's why I'm afraid he could mishandled or tortured to get that information.
Absolutely.
But it does seem as though everybody was hacking Clinton, and that there was lots of information that it was being distributed and I don't know, being used.
I take Snowden at his word. Snowden called it right from the outset. He said the job of spies is to spy. The job of spies is to penetrate foreign countries, diplomatic, political, electoral infrastructure, that they do it as a matter of course, year in and year out, and that has been used as a cover for separate penetrations that occurred of the DNC infrastructure.
I wouldn't be surprised if multiple governments had gotten into the archive of the DNC. British, French, Israel, Russians, Chinese. I mean, you're right. That's what they do for a living.
There was a story that was meant to shore up this whole narrative. That it was the Dutch Russia hacking. I call it the Dutch Russia hacking hoax. I actually wrote an article ripping that to shreds early last year as well. In that article, they talked about the measures that the DNC had taken to protect their servers after they had been notified by the FBI that there were intrusions. And one of the things that they'd done is take their servers offline for the weekend and reinstall their software. So that gives you some idea as to the ineptitude of these people and the insufficiency of their responses. And I'm going to leave it like that. I'm really sorry I have to go. But you guys have a fantastic vigil. Thank you to the viewers. I can see there's very active chat out there and people really contributing. Thank you to everyone who put in the relevant links to the things that I was talking about. And I will see you later. Thank you.
Thank you, Susie.
Thanks, Susie.
Bye.
Just about Hastings. First, we have no proof that he was murdered. His car was sped up, and he was going down the street in LA, and suddenly he lost control and then went to an enormous speed, crashed into a tree, and exploded at that point. Now, Susie put out some really interesting details there about what he might have been investigating and Brennan. And then we have to also understand that after that, WikiLeaks released Vault 7 CIA files, and one of those files showed that they had the ability to speed up remotely, to speed up a car if they wanted it, because cars are computerized today. Obviously, they found a way to hack a car and speed it up. That's all I'm going to say about that, because I don't have any absolute proof that they killed him. But I just wanted to add that.
Well, I'd like to raise another aspect of this, which I think is often missed in the debate, and that is that if Julian knew he was receiving information from foreign government sources, which showed corrupt activities taking place within the United States, by Brennan, by Hillary Clinton, corrupt electoral practices, whatever. And he used those, he selectively released those in a way to try and maximize the political impact to the media, which is what he did. How would that not be? I mean, the fact that he would have been cooperating with a foreign government's intelligence service doesn't seem to me to make that illegal from a journalistic perspective. I mean, just at all. I mean, journalism, and spy services constantly provide information to journalists. They do it all the time. They usually do it with like background sources. We've got 3 authoritative sources who are in the know who have told us this information. And I mean, it just doesn't make any sense.
Excellent point, Alice. I'm glad you raised that. I've thought about that myself. Even if Russia gave the emails directly to Assange, that is not illegal. It's a political charge. It's not a legal charge. The United States is not at war with Russia. You read the treason clause, which is in the Constitution. Treason is, you have to be at war with a country for someone, and it has to be a citizen of the United States, by the way.
He's not there. He's in England. I mean, he's in
England. He's an Australian. He was an Ecuadorian. U.S. was not at war with Russia. There's no treason. There's nothing illegal about that at all, even if it were Russia. You're making an excellent point. Just as there was nothing illegal as if he told somebody in the Trump campaign, we got these emails, we're going to put them out. What's illegal about that?
Right. There's nothing illegal about any of it.
The only real illegal conspiracy would have been if somebody in the Trump campaign worked with Russia to hack those emails. That's the only crime here, taking private emails. In addition to that, by the way, I should add, those emails are not classified. They're private emails. They're not classified. So we can eliminate the Espionage Act from any talk of the 2016 campaign. Even if Russia gave them to him, even if Vladimir Putin showed up at the embassy with himself and handed those emails to Julian Assange, that is not a crime. It's certainly not under the Espionage Act, because that's not classified information. Those are just private emails. The only crime involved was the taking of those emails, because they are private and you're not allowed to take somebody's emails. It's nowhere near up on the scale of classified information being leaked. These were private emails only, but there's no crimes involved here. Nobody from the Trump campaign helped GRU hack these emails or anything like that. That's why Mueller, who was really intent on getting Assange on this conspiracy with Russia, couldn't come up with a conspiracy on Russia, and why those of us who from the very beginning said that this collusion conspiracy with Russia was complete nonsense were totally vindicated by the Mueller report. But that doesn't stop our friends at MSNBC and all the Democratic and liberal.
Well, I mean, wait a minute. Let's be very careful about Robert Mueller, because I mean, Robert Mueller is the 9/11 investigation guy. I mean, and the 9/11 investigation. I mean, he didn't do the. I mean, he did the investigation, the official investigation by the government, which resulted in the 28 pages, which Trump eventually released. I don't know, 20 years later, roughly. In which he took a direction from the Bush White House at the time not to investigate a obvious and very important lead, the most important lead that there was about the connections of the hijackers to Saudi Arabia.
Right.
So, I mean, the Mueller investigation report is, I mean, he's treated as though he's Saint Robert Mueller, but I mean, he's very much a member of the establishment, and I mean, and that report is.
They defrocked him because he didn't come up with what they wanted.
Right.
He couldn't.
And that's it. I mean, he's a prosecutor who presents only one side of the case. That's all it is. It's not like the report of a blue ribbon commission, and you say, well, these are the findings of the blue ribbon commission. He's a prosecutor. He is one party to a case. So,
yeah, but in this case, I think it's even less than that. I mean, he's framed the case.
Right, he's framed, and even then, I agree.
And he's narrowly framed it around this issue of collusion, which is what Trump wanted it to be framed around. I mean, there's so there's that aspect of it, and then when it comes back to Assange, why is Assange still in the gun for all of this? Is this just some kind of weird payback that Brennan is like? The prosecution of Assange and what he was charged with doesn't make any sense either. I mean, it's a trivial offence. It's barely extraditable. Cracking a password in the circumstances that he did, I mean, it's not even that clearly an offensive.
I think once he's in Americans' hands, they're going to hit him with everything. I mean, you know, they're going to throw the kitchen sink at him. I mean, you know, they're going to hit him on for espionage, terrorism. You know, they're going to throw everything at him, and the media will sit silently for that, because
under international law, they're not allowed to do that.
They are allowed to do that because there's an exemption in the extradition treaty that as long as the facts of the case, as long as the new charges you bring are based on the same facts of the case, you can do that. So unless, you know, so as long as they don't change and go on to some other case with some other facts, but if it's the same facts, then they can indeed hit you with all sorts of charge.
In that indictment on the so-called intrusion in the computers, which is we know he was only trying to protect Chelsea's identity, not to hack into a computer that she had legal access to. But in that indictment, they mentioned the Espionage Act, Section C and E.
Right.
E is possession and dissemination of classified information, which Assange certainly had, and C was just an attempt to do that. But they didn't charge him under that in that indictment. But they very likely now, as we discussed at the beginning, Alistair, this leaked letter to Domscheit Berg, close associate of Assange from 2010, that the government wants him to talk to them, and that would be under the Espionage Act. So they mentioned it in that indictment, so that they could that become a fact in the case, as George just pointed out, so they can indict him on that, and then later, just on this flimsy charge, and then later they can hit him with the Espionage Act because they mentioned it in the first indictment. That's a fact.
Okay, so I mean, forgive me for going back to American media. The American media is reporting this on the basis that they think that this was very carefully charged in such a way so as not to make the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Post or anyone else feel as though they are also going to potentially be subject to use of the Espionage Act.
That's correct, because that's the way the media read that indictment. And right now, he has not been indicted under the Espionage Act. It was only mentioned in that.
Right. But I think that once they do charge him with those things, I think that, you know, the government will turn around and tell the New York Times and the Washington Post and the BBC and everybody else that this is a one-off. WikiLeaks is sui generis. We're going after WikiLeaks, but we're never going to go after the New York Times. We're not going to go after the Washington Post. Don't worry about it. WikiLeaks isn't really a journalistic outfit anyway, so it's not part of the respectable media like you are. And so don't worry about anything. It's just WikiLeaks that we're targeting. And the media will sit still for it. I mean, they always have in the past. They're not going to go, protesting, going on hunger strike or whatever. They will sit still for, well, maybe WikiLeaks isn't really a serious media outlet. Maybe it is just a one-off.
Well, they do.
Well, they were starting to turn though. I mean, prior to the Mueller report coming out, the media was. There was various op-eds had been published by USA Today, and there was an increasing amount of mainstream support for Julian starting to emerge.
Because they see the danger. They see the danger. It's on the horizon, and even if the Trump administration doesn't go after the friendly, well, they're not friendly to Trump. See, that's why it's dangerous, because Trump, especially in the second term, if he gets one, could indeed use this to go after them. But even if Trump does it, this is now on the books. It's a slippery slope. A future administration could do it because there would be precedent. But you're right, George. They don't see WikiLeaks as a journalistic outfit. The New York Times, in their awful editorial, said he didn't do what we do. He actually hacked in. We don't hack. Well, it wasn't a hack. But this is setting a precedent for the future, which is enormously dangerous. And their asses are on the line because of this, even if they're in denial about it.
Right. That's exactly right. Yeah. They're in denial about it, and it's a way for them just to swallow it. Hey, well, it doesn't really affect us. I mean, we're the respectable media, we're the established media. That's just WikiLeaks. It's Julian Assange. The guy who smears feces on walls and doesn't clean up after his cat. Doesn't apply to us.
That's why.
I think we should describe him as the guy that's been tortured in the Ecuadorian embassy for 10 years.
Of course.
This is why it's significant. Baer, the Attorney General of the United States, in the press conference releasing the full Mueller report, said that he called WikiLeaks a publisher. He said that WikiLeaks is a publisher. They cannot be prosecuted for the 2016 election because they didn't participate in the hack. They had no evidence of that. But the fact that he called it a publisher, I think, is very significant because that confirms, at least in his mind, and he's the top legal law enforcement official of the whole United States of America, that he's a journalist and a publisher. So how could they now say that he was not doing publishing when the Attorney General said that? I thought that was very significant, an overlooked remark that he made.
Well, it was, but I mean, why are they still trying to extradite him if that's the case? I mean, they are quite obviously still trying to extradite him for some sort of minor offense.
No, I'll tell you why, because the Espionage Act, the way it's written, allows the government to prosecute a journalist or a publisher for having unauthorized possession of classified information and also disseminating it. Now,
but in that case, they can prosecute everybody, can't they?
Yes,
so I mean,
that's the whole point here. That's why the New York Times should be afraid if they do that under the Espionage Act, because that opens them up to the same prosecution. Even if they, as George probably correctly points out, they're going to tell them, don't worry, we're not going after you. You're the respectable media. But it sets the precedent that it could be done. They could go after him. And in addition to that, that 1961 amendment in the act allows the United States to prosecute anyone, a foreign citizen, a foreign national on foreign territory. It became a universal act in 1961, the Espionage Act, global. U.S. can get him out.
So the end game here is martyring Julian Assange with the purpose of chilling, sending a very, very strong chilling effect over the entire free press, basically.
Not the only purpose is what Susie said before. They want to get him in jail forever, and they can torture him to try to get his sources. They want to destroy WikiLeaks, which is another thing you missed at the beginning, George, is that these concentric circles around Assange are starting to widen. They're going after associates. Cassandra Fairbanks said that they discussed her during the grand jury hearings. And I hope Cassandra joins us. She said in a direct message to me that she's going to try to join us to talk about that. So this is what's really frightening now. They want to destroy WikiLeaks, but they went for the...
Well, but also, and they want to kill the idea of WikiLeaks. They want to kill the idea of hacking-based initial source, full source journalism. And the thing is, in the current circumstances that we're living in with a surveillance society, that's the only effective journalism that can be done into these matters. It's not, I mean, it has to be whistleblowers or hacking. I mean, that's the only way these sorts of source materials are going to come out. And when you're fighting against the United States, which has, I don't know, such extraordinary amounts of lethal force, then you have to expect that it's a fairly rational soft power response from the Chinese and the Russians to acquire these sorts of damaging information and to use it against the Americans. And it strikes me as being arguably completely legitimate for them to do so.
You know, what underscores what you just said is that Chelsea Manning first went to the New York Times and the Washington Post with these cables and leaks and the Clara murder video, and they turned her down. So she went to WikiLeaks. So you're right. This is the only kind of real media left we have because of the sycophantic nature of the corporate media. And they are pushing this agenda of the state, not the people, which they're supposed to do. So that's a very good point you're making there. That they are going to try to destroy that type of journalism. Why? Because it's risking their impunity. They've had impunity, thanks to the corporate media largely, to get away with these crimes. And WikiLeaks came along as an exposing them. But all down to saving their own butts here, to save their own careers, to save themselves from being under an enlightened government, prosecuted themselves for these crimes. But we don't live under an enlightened government. We live on a draconian, dark system right now that's going after the remaining and the only way that the public can learn what their elected officials are doing, and particularly their unelected, powerful intelligence agencies.
And incidentally, and when you're talking about international law and extradition, I mean, since when the Americans really cared about international law? So even if they switch the charge and bring in completely new charges based on completely new facts, and the British complain and say, well, this is all violating international law. I mean, the hell with it. I mean, you think Trump is going to lose any sleep because the British are upset because he's violated international law? Pompeo is going to get upset. I mean, let's say, yeah, sure. As George W. Bush said, international law. Where's my lawyer? I mean, so I mean, that's the Americans really couldn't give two hoots about international law.
Nor the Brits too, by the way.
No, the Brits, exactly. But they might find it a little bit insulting if they having extradited them, and they might say, "Hey, this is a bit of a slap in the face." And America says, "Well, too bad. You get slapped occasionally."
Yeah, they'll get back in line.
Yeah.
I mean, so I can't see any possible. I mean, I can't see any possible legal reason to hold Julian beyond May the 2nd. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but from what I know about criminal law and what I know about bail and what I know about rules of custody, he's not a flight risk. He's sick. He's been in custody. He's been tortured. There's a million questions about the nature and the way in which he was taken out of his asylum, whether it was real asylum or not. And there's no way that they can continue to hold him.
There is no way that the British,
unless they invoke some terrorism law or something like that. I mean, there is no legal basis to do so.
Well, they're not going to hold him. They're going to send him to the U.S. Which will
yeah. Neither the British nor the Americans are going to accept Julian Assange walking out of prison and returning to edit WikiLeaks. I mean, they're not going to accept this. They're going to fight to the bitter end to prevent this.
But it's not about fighting. I mean, there is no law. Like, I mean, there's literally no law upon which he can continue to be held. I mean, they can't extradite him straight away. The law of extradition is that you're entitled to an extradition hearing.
Well, they're going to do. Well, he's going to be in jail for a year for skipping bail. They're not going to give him bail after skipping bail. So he's going to.
There's no underlying charge anymore. I mean, that's nonsense.
Skip bail.
Yeah, but that's not an offence. It's not a real offence. Skipping bail is not a
real offence, and it carries maximum 1 year in jail, which is what they're going to give him.
They can't do that. They have to do that on a reasonable basis. I mean, it's like when the sentencing guidelines are executed by the judge, they just can't do that. Even if they gave him a year, it would probably on parole, he would be entitled to be released early. So.
He's a flight risk because he skipped bail the first time. They'll come up with some reasoning. They're going to put him away for a year, and in that year, there's going to be extradition hearing. Now, if it goes beyond a year, what happens then? That's an interesting question. Suppose the extradition hearing is tied up in the European Court of Human Rights, and his 1 year sentence for that bail skipping is served. What do they do with him then?
Look, I think as soon as this turns into a proper legal dispute, then this does last for 5, 6, 7 years. I mean, Kim.com, the Americans desperately wanted him from New Zealand. They haven't got him.
How do they hold it beyond a year, that the maximum sentence for skipping bail is my question, which I hadn't thought about before. If the extradition proceedings go beyond a year, which we hope they do, and they might.
Yeah, but I mean, honestly, I mean, the legal system in Britain is not the same as that in America. The judge is not entitled to just come up with some ridiculous sentence, which is non-valid. I mean, that would be subject to appeal.
But 12 months is valid. That's the 12 months is the
it's not valid. It's not valid. You get to appeal against a sentence of a judge in the British courts, and it has to be in line with sentencing guidelines or with reasonableness.
Yeah, and how long
within the?
They can make
well, it's not reasonable. It's completely unreasonable to hold him for any longer than one more day, isn't it? I mean, any halfwit can see that.
It was more than unreasonable that he was arrested at all. It was a violation.
Yeah, true. But that's precisely why I think he will be released on May the 2nd, unless he's charged with some other offence. Because
that's never going to happen. Just there's no way. That judge, did you see what that judge, the way he talked to him, just called him a narcissist? I mean, based on nothing. I mean, this is a judge. Does he have any psychiatric training? He just calls him a narcissist without no basis whatsoever. This is not a judge who's just going to let him walk out of that court.
But the judge, Jennifer Robinson presumably has already drafted a complaint against him as a judicial officer in this particular case. Those remarks about narcissism basically disqualify him from continuing to hear the case.
Well, I agree with you. It should disqualify him. Doesn't mean that he will be disqualified.
But they do. This means that they just simply do, and there are methods for that to be taken to a higher court.
Right, but he all that time he will still be in jail. I mean, even as he makes his appeals, you don't just
have to take very long. I mean, honestly, like this is not a. I mean, I think often people look at if you have a terror case, if you have a terror
on the skipping bail. I mean, he did skip bail. I mean, he, of course, had a good reason to skip bail. But as far as the court
Nobody
is concerned, you say
nobody ever gets a year in bail. Nobody ever gets a year in jail for skipping bail. Ever. I've never heard of that.
Julian
I don't
Assange.
think it's just, I mean, it's just not going to happen.
Boy, I love your enthusiasm, Alice.
Yes.
I agree with you, unfortunately.
I'm sorry, but I think there's zero chance that he's going to walk out on May the 2nd.
Well, I'm gonna hope that he is.
I'm going to hope as well, but I wouldn't count on it.
And then he can tell us what happened about various other things, and hopefully go back to Australia or something.
Right.
I mean, I think one of the things which is really interesting about all of this is that none of this would have happened at all, but for this Unity for J movement. I don't think that. I mean, Julian would have been whisked onto a plane very quickly, much more, without any defense. The media, as you say, have completely given up on him.
Well, we've made a great effort, but I wouldn't inflate our importance that much, frankly. I have no way of knowing. I think we contributed, but there are other people. But to what, though? The guy's in a jail right now, and he's going to spend a year in jail while the extradition hearing goes on, if Francis Dore was wrong, that he won't be immediately extradited like the next day. So they're not reasonable. You keep saying reasonable. These people aren't reasonable. They want him. They need to stop him. He's an existential threat to them, to their careers, to even going to jail if we had a real system of justice in the U.S.
Yeah, but he's not in the U.S. He's in Europe.
51st state. Barely in Europe, by the way. We know how long they're going to be in Europe.
I don't know. I mean, that's another good reason I mean, the political situation is sort of febrile in the UK as well. I mean, I don't think the courts are going to be slavishly following Sajid Javid.
Well, that's the other question, whether it's up to the Home Secretary to decide or the court.
It's not up to the Home Secretary. It's very, very clear. He doesn't have the power to extradite a citizen of Australia. I mean, I don't know. I mean, it would be good if the Australian government would come to his defence. It would be good if other governments did as well. I mean, if the New Zealand government perhaps put in a amicus brief or something. I mean, I don't know. It's the most astonishing sort of situation of persecution and.
Yeah. Again, if you remember with Pinochet, the ultimate decision on the non-extradition of Pinochet was made by the Home Secretary. So Pinochet had already been ruled, the courts had said he has to be sent to Spain. And then the Home Secretary, Jack Straw, made the decision that he's not going to do it. He's not going to send him. Yeah. And Pinochet was on a plane back to Chile.
So the Home Secretary and the Minister of Justice in New Zealand have the power to prevent an execution, an extradition.
In New Zealand, we're talking about the UK. We're not talking about New Zealand.
But the law's the same. It's more or less the same.
But you're assuming that the courts are going to decide not to extradite him, which is quite an assumption.
If the lower court decided to extradite him without having an extradition proceeding, that would be completely illegal.
All right. Okay. But,
and it would immediately go to the High Court, and the High Court would say, well, he's entitled to an extradition proceedings. This is the first extradition proceeding on this particular extradition charge. So it's not like this isn't the one that he ran away from.
Right, but that's an extradition proceeding. But if it rules against him, then it rules against him.
But the extradition proceeding in and of itself can take 5 years, as you pointed out, and then at the end of that 5 years, he's probably got the right to appeal to the International Court of Human Rights.
No, he's
and the European Court of Human Rights.
Going to have to appeal.
And I mean, sorry.
You should have an appeal ready right away to do that, in case they pull a fast one and try to get him on a plane the next.
They can't do fast ones. That's rendition. It's like, I mean, it's just
exactly rendition. That's what we're talking
about. Right. And this is the point that Francis Boyle was making.
That's why they wanted him in Sweden. I mean, that's the whole purpose of the whole Sweden exercise, was to take him to Sweden, where they did have a fast track procedure for effectively complying with US extradition.
Well, he may wind up going to Sweden. That's another possibility.
I don't think so. I mean, the case has disappeared. The head of the Bar Association in Sweden has basically said that it's ridiculous. The whole thing was a farce.
Yes, we know that. They dropped the case immediately, and then it was revived again. And there's still a statute of limitations till next year. So there's still a possibility that this case will be reopened. That was said the very day of Assange's arrest, that the Swedish prosecutors were considering reopening it because of a request from one of the complainants. So
yeah, but I mean, I don't know. I mean, this is a little bit like that crazy story that was published in The Guardian. I mean, everything's just, it's like an alternative reality is sort of somehow exists around Assange, where there's no rule of law applies and people are just allowed to sort of like bullshit and make shit up.
The alternative reality of the U.S. government.
Well, I mean, Americans are very impressed with the alternative reality of the US government, but this is the reason I haven't been to the United States since 2002. It's like, yeah, it's even though Americans will try to tell me that it's perfectly safe. I mean, it's not perfect.
And also that the MI6 wants this guy in jail forever as much as the CIA does. Britain wants him silenced too.
Yeah, they may well want him silenced, but unless they've got some legal basis upon which to do that, they can't do it. I mean,
the legal basis would be saying this extradition warrant is fine.
Yeah.
Now, that's what the judge will say. This is fine. Don't see anything wrong with it. Now, then I suppose Assange's lawyers could say, we want to appeal. But then the issue is, you have to have a leave to appeal. I mean, this is what Francis Boyle.
No.
It's not automatic. No, it's not automatic. You just sort of appeal and then that goes straight to a high court. You have to have leave to appeal.
There has to be a first extradition proceeding. There has not been an extradition proceeding. The initial proceeding, your right to have an initial proceeding exists.
Yeah. Okay, and that could be pretty quick.
He's never had.
Warrant. That's the warrant.
No, the warrant is not a proceeding.
No, I know, but the judge looks at the warrant and says, this is fine. I see no problem with it.
There is a right to object to the warrant and then immediately schedule a proceeding, which is exactly what's going to happen on May the 2nd. The only question I think is, will he be granted bail or not? I suspect that
he'll be granted bail. There's no way in the world he'll be granted bail.
No way.
No way in the world. Having jumped bail, he will not be granted bail.
No, and then having been refused bail, he will then, there will immediately be an appeal lodged against the decision to refuse bail because there's no justification for it.
Right, and the High Court could.
He's sick.
To hear the appeal. It's not automatic that the High Court accepts the appeal. They can say, "Well, we don't."
You're exactly. That's the point. No, you have a right to file an appeal.
On an appeal about bail, it is automatic. He will be heard, and they will, and yeah.
And the hearing will be very quick. They say you jump bail.
Yes, it will.
It'll be very quick. You jump bail, you have no right to bail. That's it. The judge is going to be very quick on this issue. And as for being sick, he said we've got the best doctors in the world in our prisons. Yeah, so that argument isn't going to go.
They won't let him see it. His doctor said he needed to be hospitalized, and they haven't taken him to the hospital. Right. His doctor saw him in the prison in Belmarsh and said he needs to be hospitalized, and they just ignored that.
Ignored it, yeah.
Well, and then that's another thing that can be raised and as a basis for insisting on his release.
For sure, it should be and it will be. But George and I are saying they're not going to listen to that.
Right.
Everything based on what they've done so far and what we know, they're not going to.
I reckon this is my guess. I reckon if they try every legal trick in the books to try and keep him in jail for a bit longer, they'll be able to hold him in jail for another fortnight at the most.
Well, I'm not sure where you get that from, but I hope you're right. For our American viewers, a fortnight is 2 weeks. I actually used that headline in the Consortium News, saying a fortnight after his arrest. We're having another. Look, even under normal circumstances, I doubt this, but these are not normal circumstances, and they will not give him bail. I don't even know if the High Court will accept his appeal. But my question that's raised, and I'm going to ask Francis Boyle about this, is what happens if the proceedings go on beyond a year and he served his time? What are they going to keep him for then? That's why they're going to get him back right away. I think he's right. Maybe not on May 3rd, but I don't think they're going to let it stretch to a year unless they go to the European Court of Human Rights, where they can try to
But
tie
is he still, wouldn't he still be under arrest based on the U.S. extradition request? Wouldn't he still be under arrest? Because remember, Pinochet was under arrest, essentially. I mean, he had a pretty nice arrest. He was living in a home, but he was still technically under arrest during the whole extradition process.
That's correct. That's the answer, George. Thank you. They will keep him.
Well, the other thing too is the offence he's under arrest for, under the extradition arrest thing, is he's got a 5-year jail term, which is a pretty. I mean, a 5-year jail term in British terms means likely a suspended sentence. I mean, it's unless there's some good reason to put you in jail because you're dangerous or you've done a whole lot of legal things before, you've been convicted of.
And that's exactly what they're going to say about him. He is dangerous, a true public menace.
But they can't. I mean, it's like he's being convicted.
Well, they can. I mean, yeah, they can. Yeah, they can.
He's helping terrorists. Come on, they come up with anything. He's a dangerous man. And interestingly, if they kept him in jail, if the extradition process lasted 5 years, you wonder whether they could say, well, he served his 5 years, He served his time.
Arguably what he mainly did, and what they're most annoyed about, is that he helped members of the Democratic Party see what had happened to their party.
Well, that's what the liberals in the U.S. and the Democrats are upset with him about, but it has nothing to do with these charges. This has to do with the Manning era releases of classified information, and he's going to be charged under the Espionage Act now. It's pretty clear once he gets to the U.S., and it was mentioned in the first indictment, so that's a fact.
Yeah, no, I know that. I know, but the interesting thing is that the moral justification for denigrating him and holding him in jail and sending him to jail, as far as the public of America are concerned, is the WikiLeaks thing. That's why they go on and on about it. That's why Mueller put that Seth Rich remarks in his report.
No,
I mean, and it was interesting that Barr defended him. I mean, it does seem possible that one of the acts of Attorney General Barr was to basically say, well, you can't charge him with any more serious offences. You can only charge him.
You can't charge him. That's what he said. But you're right. The public mind is conflated. His arrest with the 2016 election have nothing to do with each other. He cannot be charged on the 2016 election, but he's being charged on the Manning leaks. And he can be charged on that the way the Espionage Act is currently written. It's never been done by an American president before. Nixon tried it, and then that grand jury collapsed against the New York Times reporter in the Pentagon Papers case. But no one has crossed that red line to prosecute a journalist or a publisher, which Barr, the Attorney General, called WikiLeaks a publisher. They've never done that before. It will very likely be the first case. That's what we're faced with here.
I presume there'll be a case for Chelsea Manning's release in America as well, which is going to be in parallel with this. They're still holding her, I think, aren't they?
She lost her appeal to get out of jail. She's refusing to testify against Assange. She's in a jail in contempt of court of that grand jury. So she lost, and she's going to stay there. They need her.
I was going to ask you, Joe, about that. Now, she doesn't have the Fifth Amendment rights, because they offered her immunity. Would it be possible for her just to say to every question, "I don't recall"? Just whatever it is, I don't recall. Would that be acceptable?
That's acceptable for politicians to use, not when they're in a hearing in Congress, because I don't recall. I don't recall anybody, a non-politician, ever using "I don't recall."
Right. I just wonder whether if you can get out of that whole Fifth Amendment thing, just say, "Look, I don't recall." I mean, they can't. I got a bad memory.
That's a good question. I hadn't thought of that. She could say, I was tortured in prison and my memory was damaged. I don't remember. I don't recall. I don't recall.
Right. It's a long one. It's a long time ago now.
Somehow
yeah,
I could
exactly.
put her back in jail again if she said that. Till you recall, we're keeping you in jail till you recall.
But I mean, presumably there's another court that can then a further appeal could be lodged in her favour too.
They might be doing that.
I mean, I think this case is now in the hands of the courts.
Oh, indeed. But do we trust the courts?
Well, we need to.
You do.
Well, if we don't have the courts, we have nothing.
Yes, we have nothing. That's right. You're absolutely right. We've got no media anymore. We've got no parliament or Congress anymore. They're all bought. We've got no fucking courts. Sorry. We've got no courts.
Well, your Supreme Court is completely fucked, that's for sure.
Well, that's true. And therefore we have no democracy.
Hmm.
When you lose all of those things, what do you got left?
Yeah.
Crazy man in the White House tweeting all day long.
There's been an interesting dynamic in all of this, which is basically one of the fascinating things I've found about Unity for J is the fact that there is an alliance to some extent with elements of the alt-right. There's a natural affinity because I mean we're both concerned about attacks on free speech.
Well,
Free speech and against war and crimes of government.
Yeah, I mean Alex Jones is a complete moron and crazy person who says very nasty, untrue, mean things about people, but I mean he is against war.
Well, he's libertarian. The American libertarians share some reasonable positions that they are generally anti-interventionist and they are concerned about privacy rights and the government because they hate the government. They don't want government. So the government's intruding on our privacy. So therefore, yes, it's a natural thing. But also there are Trump people who think that Julian helped Trump get elected, and they have this nonsensical thing that somehow this is all a plot to get into the U.S. and then he's going to spring him from jail and reveal all the truth about the 2016 blah 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 blah. That ain't going to happen.
Not gonna happen. No.
That's the Trump 5D chess that he's playing.
Yeah.
No, it doesn't.
I think Trump learned his lesson from he got terrified when all these agencies turned on him and almost toppled his government. I just think he's not gonna mess with CIA and FBI anymore. So I think he learned his lesson from all of that. So that's why really all of that audacious talk from 2016, we haven't heard any of that from Trump. I mean, I think he knows now who the masters are, and he's not gonna do anything to upset any of those people in the CIA, FBI, or Pentagon.
Well, he is calling for an investigation of them, and he's saying that they tried a coup against him. But as far
he hasn't done much. I mean, for all of that, he could have declassified all of this material a long time ago. He's elected not to do so.
That's absolutely
on
right.
the advice of these people.
Yep. No, they've tamed him. There's no question about that. He is their creature now.
Right.
And particularly on foreign policy too. We could say
right.
He's done worse things to Russia than Obama ever did.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, we have 12 minutes left, and I think this has been a good freewheeling conversation at the end. And I think disagreement is always helpful for good journalism, a good broadcast, or whatever. So we were very happy to disagree with you, Alistair, about that, but we hope you're right. You have an abiding faith in the British legal system. And I got a feeling that's going to start evaporating starting on May 2nd, but it's good that you have it still, I guess. I don't know.
It's very funny having that kind of faith in the British legal system because I grew up in London, and very few people had a great faith in the British legal system. I mean, there was a great columnist, Bernard Levin. I mean, he just hated the British judges. I mean, it was, he thought that they were stupid and nasty and just lacking plain common sense. I mean, so it was a regular thing with him, just denouncing the British judges. So I don't remember any time that people had a great respect for the British legal system. I mean, it's very grand with all the wigs and everything, but that doesn't mean that their judgments are in any way sound or on behalf of the freedom of the individual.
Well, the wigs make them look dignified. The wigs make them look very dignified. By the way, Susie Dawson has written here in the chat that the Home Secretary is the final say on extradition, Alistair. That's who signs the order to extradite. The Home Secretary is the one who signs the extradition. We are in a post-law world. So that's
It's so, but the Home Secretary only signs the extradition order after the court process is finished.
right, and we expect the court to do that, but
Yeah.
you don't, and we hope you're right.
Well, I mean, it's just that the court process can't be accelerated.
They can deny his appeal.
Well, I think he can't. You might remember, Assange is not a British citizen. So, you're not a British citizen. You don't get all of the rights of British citizens. So they can accelerate it in his case.
He's been through this before because, he did it with Sweden.
Right.
And there was an accelerated process within Europe for internal extradition as well, which is partly why that was the method that they tried to use to capture him in the first place.
Right, and that's why he went into the embassy, because Sweden did not say that they wouldn't extradite him to the U.S. Not because he didn't want to face the music over those sexual allegation charges. He did. He invited the prosecutor to come to the embassy and interview him, which he eventually did after enormous British pressure not to. Susie's back with us.
But I think it's more serious.
Hi, sorry, I couldn't help myself.
It's all right.
I couldn't help myself. I had to get back on and give my 2 cents. I actually just promised the chat that I would. Alistair, the reason that the judge called him a narcissist is because that's what the intelligence agencies called him. The intelligence agencies called Chelsea Manning a narcissist. The intelligence agencies called Julian Assange a narcissist. The intelligence agencies called Edward Snowden a narcissist. This is the language of the intelligence agencies because the judge is in the pocket of the military-industrial complex and the intelligence agencies. There is absolutely no way that the country which spent £30 million until they stopped us knowing how many more £1 million they were spending on policing their embassy and keeping Julian captive inside their embassy, where he was, without any doubt, being tortured. You look at the condition that he was in when he came out of that embassy. They weren't doing that for kicks. They were doing that because they want him in jail or dead. They would not respect the diplomatic status that he was granted by Ecuador after he was made a citizen. They would not respect 2 United Nations decisions which said that he should be freed and that he should be compensated. They do not respect their own laws, international law, or anyone else's laws. We are living in a post-law world. Everything that Trump is doing, look at Venezuela, look at everything else. We are living in a post-law world. The idea that the law or the courts are going to come to save Julian is completely, I would say at this point, no offense to you personally, deranged. You would have to be deranged to believe that the persecutors will save us from the persecution. No, they will not. They will continue to perpetrate the persecution that they've been perpetrating for the last 7 years. And it's completely pie in the sky to consider otherwise. The question at this point is, will Julian end up in Diego Garcia? Which rendition site will Julian end up in? And I'd just like to qualify the extradition actually is rendition. By definition, if you go and look up extradition in Wikipedia, it will tell you that an extradition is a rendition. Extraordinary rendition is where they just snatch him and take him, so-called illegally. But legal rendition is an extradition process signed by the Home Office. So I'm sorry, but that's exactly like what is going to happen at this point. The other thing is that and this is the point that Francis Boyle was making actually, which is a valid point, which is that they don't even have to accept an appeal by Julian Assange. Like, it's all well and good to say, oh, his lawyers can appeal this, they can appeal that and the other thing. The British courts are not obliged to even accept or allow him to make an appeal. So
That's right.
They may well decide to just toss that out the window and save themselves the trouble. The idea that they will let this run for years and years and years and that there'll be this grand legal battle is ridiculous. I think the idea that he'll even see the inside of a courtroom in the United States is ridiculous. There is no guarantee whatsoever that he will ever stand trial in America if he makes it onto American soil or non-American soil if they decide to put him in Diego Garcia or some other military base. There is every indication that he will be treated as a terrorist, that anti-terrorism legislation will be invoked in his case. There is years of public narrative by US politicians and members of the intelligence community already designating him as a terrorist and designating WikiLeaks as a terrorist organization. There is every indication that they will not ever want him to testify, let alone an open public hearing. be it in the UK or in the United States. There is every indication that they want him silenced. That's why they silenced him for more than the last year. They don't want people hearing his voice. They don't want him having the ability to testify or to communicate with the public by any means. So I just find it ludicrous that we would place our hope in the same system which is solely responsible for his persecution to date. That's my 2 cents on that front.
5 cents.
Well, I mean, in response, I understand how we all feel about all these things, but my view of the current state of the lack or presence of the rule of law in the world is that it's febrile. I would describe the international legal situation as febrile, and it's certainly in play. There's a lot of confusion about multilateralism and international law, but the good guys haven't given up. They haven't surrendered yet, and the judiciary it's a complicated process. I mean, they're independent agents. I mean, they don't. This particular judge, the one that called him a narcissist, he's obviously in the pocket of the intelligence, as you say, because he called him a narcissist, and it's completely inappropriate. And in doing so, I think he's disqualified himself from hearing the case. And I think that will be I think that'll be grounds for Jennifer Robinson to object to him continuing to have.
Well, there may be grounds. It doesn't mean that that'll be accepted. I mean, you can ask
the higher courts. It's like this is such a high-profile case. The entire world is watching this. On the day that he was arrested, he was trending on every single country in the world. He was #1 all day long. I mean, Julian Assange has become a martyr of enormous enormous consequence when it comes.
And you think the British authorities regard him as a martyr? You think the British politicians, British courts, British legislators, they think of him as a martyr? No, they think of him as a little shit, and they want to destroy him.
Yeah, but I think that the political processes are cognizant of the way in which things are perceived. If they charge him with terrorism, which is the only way I think they can continue to hold him, which probably is possible, they may well be able to sort of manufacture some evidence that he's a terrorist. Then they will open up the door for basically an absolute avalanche. I mean, at that point, it's easier for them to let him go. So, I mean, they have to make a choice. And I think it's going to be very interesting to know what happens on May the 2nd, because
I don't understand why you think it's easy. I think the easiest thing for them to do would be to accede to the Americans' demands, pack him off to America. The British have washed their hands of him. Let the Americans handle him.
Because I'm saying that. I mean, that's just not the way it works.
It does work like that. That is exactly how it works.
He doesn't have to seek an appeal. Can I just make this point very, very clearly? If you get arrested, you're entitled to a trial. If you get accused by a foreign government, you're entitled to an extradition hearing. It's not a question of whether or not the Home Secretary can stop them, or you have to ask for an appeal.
There's no automatic appeal. There is no automatic appeal. How many times are we going to say this? If it's not, if the appeal is not accepted,
we are in a post-law world. Even in New Zealand, Alistair, you're one of the 2 bravest publishers in New Zealand, okay? But you know what happens in New Zealand if you're designated as a threat to national security? I'll tell you what happens. They now have court hearings in New Zealand where the defendant is not even notified they're having the court hearing, where only the prosecution appears, where the evidence is secret evidence, where the media are barred from reporting on it. That's in New Zealand. That is in the most transparent, least corrupt country in the world. They can strip your citizenship without even telling you they've done it. And you know that I know about this because you know that my situation is right up there, okay? In the UK, it is the same. In the US, it is the same. They can use secret evidence. They can use secret witnesses. They can not even notify the defendants of stuff that they are doing. We are in a post-law world. We're in a post-law world. Your open court lasted 15 minutes. 15 minutes after 70 years.
The May 2nd appearance is not going to last 15 minutes. This appearance is not going to last 15 minutes.
What have we seen so far? Okay, we've seen Judge Arbuthnot, whose husband is a defense contractor and a weapons salesman. Okay, that was the person who refused to strike down the arrest warrant, the UK arrest warrant last year. We've seen Michael Snow now, Judge Michael Snow, who is calling Julian a narcissist and wrapping his gavel in 15 minutes and throwing him out of the court. The idea that any of the higher judges or any of the higher courts are going to be less in the pocket of the military industrial complex, less in the pocket of the UK and US elite is ridiculous. We know who they are appointed by. We know who they're rewarded by. Those judges are after becoming a sir or a dame. That's what they're after. They're not after justice. They're not after, I mean, they know full well what will happen to them. Look at what's happened in New Zealand to lawyers and to judges who've ruled in favour in terrorism cases or in high-profile cases. You know, lawyers who won in the Op 8 case were relentlessly persecuted and even disbarred after having had
the lawyers who won in the Zawi case, they are fine. I mean, they're fated. You can defeat the government in a human rights case, in a prominent human rights case, and you can become a hero. If you defeat the government in a freedom of press case, which establishes, I mean, the British can't stand American judicial system. From a political perspective, whilst Julian Assange is not enormously popular, I mean, he's somebody who's got a very, very strong following. People have strong opinions about it. It is.
I think he's enormously popular amongst everyday people on the street. Like when George Galloway walked down the streets of London interviewing totally random strangers saying, "What do you think about Julian Assange and WikiLeaks?" 90% of them were in support, even after years of mainstream media smears. What he is not popular with is the militaries, the military industrial complex, the private contractors, the intelligence agencies, the politicians on both sides.
Well, no, so I mean, just a second. On the day that he was arrested, the Labour Party immediately said that they thought that it was inappropriate that he be held. So I mean,
that's not what the Labour Party said.
They said that they wanted there to be a proper.
Let me just. Labour Party said that he shouldn't be extradited to the United States, but it is perfectly appropriate for him to be extradited to Sweden. So that was all.
Let me tell you about the Labour Party. This is something I actually really wanted to have a quick talk about tonight, which I didn't earlier.
That is what he said. That's what the Labour Party said.
No, it's not. It was what 70 MPs said. Facts matter.
So who are you talking about? We're talking about Jeremy Corbyn. Jeremy Corbyn, who is the leader of the Labour Party, said he was on television and said specifically he doesn't think it's a great idea to extradite him to the United States, but he does think that Julian Assange should face the charges in Sweden. So that's it. He's in favor of that. So that's Jeremy Corbyn. So it's not about the 70 Labour MPs. That's the Corbyn, the leader of the party.
Well, they weren't all Labour MPs anyway. But I mean, yes.
I'd just like to point something out, Alistair, if I can, specifically about Labour and Labour activists who are now coming on board with the campaign to defend Julian Assange. I think this is a really important point because I personally think that the people who are of the belief that if Corbyn is elected, that he will free Julian or everything will work out fine for Julian are also deluded. I think they're actually as deluded as people who say that it's all in Trump's plan to extradite Julian to America because he's going to testify and be pardoned and everything's going to be hunky-dory. No, it's not. So there is a meeting at Unite House in London next week to organise the defence campaign for Julian. I'm happy that the Labour activists are getting on board. I'm happy that the unions are getting on board. In the short term, they'll hold big marches. They'll have 50,000 people march down the street and it will be a good thing for Julian. However, I can tell you from my personal activism experience, I worked and promoted Unite events in New Zealand extensively. I worked with them on the campaign against the TPP. And we had the then head of the Labour Party show up for 5 minutes at our TPP rallies and say, vote Labour, everything's fine. Once Labour will get in, we'll scrap the TPP, it's all good. And we all believe that, and many people voted Labour. Now we have a Labour government in New Zealand. They got in, they promptly renamed the TPP the Comprehensive Progressive TPP, changed a couple of clauses, shoved it through under urgency and passed it. The same legislation they'd stood up at every single rally for years before and told us they would never pass and wouldn't back and would have nothing to do with. what will happen is that the moneyed Labour unions in the UK will get behind the campaign to support Julian, and they will tell all of Julian Assange and WikiLeaks supporters, vote Corbyn, and we'll look after Julian. And Corbyn will come into power, and they will forget Julian Assange's name. And when that happens, people will want to protest against the Corbyn government, and the same Labour unions, the same Labour union leadership who protested for Julian to get Corbyn into power will say, we can't protest against Corbyn because we don't want the Tories to get back in. It's a great thing for Labour to be in. We must make sure the Tories don't get back in, which is the same thing the New Zealand activists said when the Labour government got in and passed the TPP. They said, oh no, we can't protest against the Labour government because even though they're passing the TPP, at least they're not the national government, at least they're not the right-wing government. And this is how the political co-optation of mass movements occurs. And this is how the principles of those movements are betrayed by the politicians who ride into power on the backs of them. So in the short term, I'm really pleased to see Labour getting on board with the campaign to defend Julian. But do not for 1 minute expect that that will translate into the liberation of Julian Assange if Corbyn is in power. Do not for 1 minute think that. And someone said before, you know, Susie speaks plainly, she's the voice of reason, but I hope she's wrong. I hope I'm wrong too. But from experience, this is what will happen. The movement to support Julian will be politically co-opted by parties whose primary interest is not Julian's liberation, but is the election of a political leader. And then when that political leader gets into power and has his first closed-door meetings with the intelligence agencies and gets told, oh, WikiLeaks has cost the lives of British servicemen and blah, 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 and then doesn't do shit about freeing Julian, then you will see the dissipation of those who had been a part of the campaign to date. So I'm warning all Julian Assange supporters, embrace the support while we have it of the unions. That's a good thing in the short term. But do not ever tie your cause or your movement to political aspirations of one political faction, no matter who that political faction is. Never, ever do that. For this campaign to free Julian to be successful, it must be disparate, it must be decentralized. There should be dozens of movements to free Julian all around the world. Never fall in behind one political banner, and never put your hopes in a politician. Because the second you put your hopes in an establishment politician, whether they're left or they're right, you will be burned. Whether you're the Trump supporter who believed that Trump was going to end the wars, or whether you are the Corbyn supporter who believes that he will free Julian Assange, you will be disappointed. So take matters into your own hands and be very, very, very aware that this is cyclical. The co-optation of movements by political forces is as old as time. They've done it generation after generation. They are practiced at co-opting movements and then betraying the cause. So do not trust them. And that's what I want to say about that.
Right. Well,
Okay.
I mean,
Yes.
I think it's true that we can't expect the Labour Party to die in a ditch over this. But I think what we can expect is that this is going to be an incandescently significant news day on May the 2nd, and that it will lead all the news bulletins, especially if Jennifer Robinson does a good job of what she does in the court. And if the judge is the same judge and he is as stupid as he was last time, I think that will reflect very, very badly, not just on him, but on the United Kingdom. So, and the British don't like being embarrassed. No one particularly likes being embarrassed. And this case is rapidly turning into the sort of political embarrassment which is problematic to everybody involved. At some point, it becomes easier. Just let it go.
Do you know which judge is going to hear the extradition hearing on the 2nd of May?
Well, it's quite likely to be the same judge initially, unless he's been already replaced.
And who's that? Snow?
Yeah, probably. Yeah. But I don't know. I don't know. I mean, there may well have already been in Chambers hearings about this, and they may have already removed them. So, I mean, I think Jennifer Robinson's playing her cards pretty close to her chest at this stage. I mean, she doesn't seem to be making an awful lot of public statements about it.
That's reasonable, isn't it? Why would
Yeah,
they?
no, it's completely reasonable. Yeah. I mean, and Julian plays his cards pretty close to his chest as well, which is, I think, is probably also the right
I think
thing
he has
to do.
many cards left. His lawyers are holding those cards now.
Yeah.
We've come.
So I mean, I am hopeful. I'm just inevitably always hopeful with this, because otherwise, what are we going to do? I mean, we can't rise up
What we
against the
do is
state.
get off our butts and
They've got all the
organize.
guns.
we get off our butts and organize. That's what we do. You know, that's what this movement has been about all along. I was a little bit disappointed to hear you say that you perceived us to be in alliance with the outright. It's actually completely untrue. We're not in alliance with any political group or any political faction. This is a single issue movement, and the single issue is fighting for the freedom of Julian Assange. And we don't give a flying toss. We don't give a toss what the politics are of anybody who's in support of freeing Julian Assange, because this isn't about politics. It's about freeing Julian Assange. So be it socialists or outright or anything in between, or libertarians or conservatives or Labour, for God's sakes. We don't care. They all have equal standing on this issue, but none of them have the right to co-opt this issue to their individual personal politics. And, you know, that's the case. There are many people giving digital standing ovations in chat to what I was saying about Corbyn. Some of them said Susie's totally right, but we support Corbyn and we like Corbyn. I prefer Corbyn to Theresa May by a mile. I really hope that Corbyn gets in and that Theresa May is out on her ass. But I'm a realist when it comes to big money organizations co-opting movements for short-term political gains and then betraying the movement in the long term. And that was why I gave that little speech. But it was very well received by chat. So thank you. I appreciate all of you who listened to that and for whom that resonated with. And I think Joe's trying to take control back of his vigil. So I'll let him do that.
What vigil? What vigil? Oh, so yeah, right. Well, we went over time. We've got 45 more minutes technically, and I just let this go because it was great. And we let Alistair go on with his ideas, and George. And if you guys want to say anything else to finish it up with, now's your chance.
No, I think I just reiterate what I said. I think that it's good to be optimistic, but one should be realistic and know who we're dealing with. And we're dealing with the British courts. We're dealing with people who are extremely unsympathetic to Julian Assange. And I think, the British, they don't like to be humiliated. Well, they've been humiliated day in, day out, week in, week out, year in, year out by the Americans on many different issues. They've been humiliated over Brexit. So the idea that there's some extant British self-respect that's going to come into play here, I think it's an illusion. So, I think one has to be realistic. I don't know whether, Francis Boyle's assessment is correct. He may be really pessimistic, but I think it's good to be aware that things could really go seriously wrong quite soon.
Well, Alistair, even though we all disagree with you, I'm going to give you the final word.
Okay. Thank you very much, Joe. Very, very generous. I think, in conclusion, I mean, I will remain hopeful. I think the purpose of a movement like this is to raise public awareness of the issues, and I think the awareness of the issues, which was raised quite specifically by this movement, in my view, has resulted in there being a far larger number of people who are online and actively defending Julian Assange and actively making the arguments in his favor. And I think that argument is starting to win the day. And I think that was reflected in Attorney General Barr's comments when this decision was made to charge Julian. So I will remain hopeful. I think that it would be sensible for everybody concerned to let this go.
Well, on that,
and then there can be a damages case, and Julian can get some money.
Yeah, right. On an additional positive note, we're going to end this 27 years with Julian, and thanking Susie, George, Alistair, Elizabeth for joining us and discussing in a very open way and free way this vital issue.
Thank you, Joe, for organizing it.
I appreciate it, George. You're coming on again. Thank you, Susie, and thank you, Al. So
Okay.
goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Straight off the starter's block at Melbourne University sprang that little blonde-headed bugger Julian Assange, heaven sent to expose the horrible truths hiding behind the zeros and ones in the world, and by giving whistleblowers around the globe a Dropbox to expose the not-so-good, the very bad, and the most ugly. And boom! Boom went Julian. Boom! Boom went Julian. Boom! Boom went Julian. Boom! Boom went Julian. While in the UK, the little bugger retreated to the Ecuadorian embassy to avoid the great noose of the global warlord. Egged on by hungry banksters and corrupted politicians, all were scrambling to stay hidden away by telling big fat lies through a well-controlled mainstream media. They couldn't keep Pandora's box closed. The speakers, boom! Boom went Julian. Boom! Boom went Julian. Boom! Boom went Julian. Boom! Boom went Julian. While we the people all over the world are so totally fed up with the same old crap, forced and bitterly unsweetened into our lives with war, poverty, human misery, all created by wannabe masters, brutes, the lot of them. And we're getting a much better idea who they really are. Oh yeah. When boom! When boom goes Julian. 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 With right on our side and love in our hearts, the evil brutes of the world are dropping from their high chairs. Cronyism has had its day and we're going to nail the lot of them. We are the people with something incredible to work towards. Still peace, yeah, peace. We're banding together, getting ready